Oh! Ladies and gentlemen, today is August the 27th, 2023, and we are here to talk about the world. Agent Smith is going to come into voice, and we will discuss what's been happening in recent past, in distant past, currently, and maybe what might happen in the future. This is meant to be a living and breathing conversation, so if you have any comments for us, please tag me in the Twitch chat, and I can pass those along to Mr. Agent Smith. Without any further ado, I will jump into voice, and we will discuss the world in world discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Hey, how you doing?
You know, stressed, but in a good way. How are you?
I can't complain. What are you stressed about?
Well, you know how in life sometimes you have opportunities to be better and you receive feedback on how you can be better.
Okay.
Imagine that you have a 3-month period that's like pretty chillin', and then you get all the feedback from that period of time in a weekend. That's kind of where I'm at. So all of it is good information. All of it is information that I can benefit from and capitalize on. It's just kind of funny when it lines up and all hits you at the same time. It can feel like a lot of pressure. So in that sense, yeah, it's a challenge, but we're fighting through it.
Well, why all the sudden feedback?
It's kind of random, actually, because it's from different things. So,
I see.
yeah. Fire hose
So-
feedback, exactly.
Fire hose feedback. I was going to say a rogue wave of feedback, but that works too.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'll be fine. It's all surmountable stuff. Also, we've had forest fires north of us in Canada, so it's hot here and we don't have air conditioning in the Seattle area, so that just makes everything even more exciting when you're in a 80+ degree apartment. So that definitely adds some cranky mood to the whole
Do they
experience.
still not have AC in your apartment?
No. This is the thing. It wasn't supposed to be part of the climate here. We weren't supposed to need AC. This is unusual. My building is from maybe 7 years ago ish, 7 or 8 years ago, ballpark.
Yeah.
So during that period of time, we would maybe have only 1 or 2 days a year that would hit 90 degrees. Whereas in the past 3 or so years, we've had several of those, even some days that got over 110. So it's different now. And they haven't like mass installed AC units to adjust for that yet.
You ought to ask for a discount.
Yeah, I actually have negotiated rent with the increases, and that was one of the cited reasons. That is a pro tip for people in the chat. Whenever you're paying rent and stuff, you can always ask about potentially negotiating your rent level. It won't always work, but if you shower and make sure you don't smell like ass and try to look high effort, and you have a conversation with them and kind of talk about just how quickly you pay your rent and then also the different difficulties you've had, sometimes they will take mercy upon you and like knock a couple dollars off your rent amount. So it's worth a try. Worst thing they can say is no. You have your same rate. So yeah.
Well, it seems to have worked out.
Yeah, we're doing okay. Landlords are people too, it's very true. One of the new hotness things for me is Baldur's Gate 3. Holy shit. That game, it's S+ tier. It's going to be guaranteed game of the year this year. And I don't know if you've seen Hot Fuzz. Have you seen that movie?
Yeah, I saw it. I've seen it a couple times, actually.
Okay, so the lead guy in that, he plays a character called Chris Angel, and they ship him away to another town because he is overperforming past all the other police officers and making them look bad. That's Baldur's Gate as a video game. They are the Chris Angel or whatever his character's name is from Hot Fuzz with the landscape of what games deliver for their cost. It's a one-time purchase $60 new game that works. It has depth to it. It has huge variety in the outcomes. It has insane replayability. It doesn't have microtransactions along the way. You get what you get, and it's amazing. So, yeah, I think it's really good at kind of just breaking that status quo of a lot of game publishers have felt pressured to release games too early, and that's caused people to be severely disappointed in the product. Like Cyberpunk 2077 was one that had a huge hype wave all around it because it looked really good taking screenshots of the game and stuff, but when it was delivered to people, it was very broken for a lot of people. And yeah, just seeing the polish of Baldur's Gate. It's not perfect. It does still have its bugs. They did just do a patch a couple days ago, but relatively speaking, it just annihilated the composition or the competition and really embarrasses a lot of game publishers who it makes them look lazy with how good it was.
Oh, that good, huh?
Yeah, extremely super hyper good.
And you can vouch for it.
Super vouch. If I could 100-time vouch it, I would give that a 100-time vouch sticker. The only things you might be squeamish about are it has violence, it has bugs in it, and it has a lot of tragedy too. But if you can deal with all that standard kit of things, it's a ridiculously good video game.
Oh, strong recommend from Neuro.
Yes.
Well, in a couple of years, when it's heavily discounted, I'll probably give it a try.
Yeah, I would say... Actually, I don't know what the lower end PC requirements. Are you still using the same rig that Kukio made for you?
Yeah.
Because I would think that's more of the barrier than the cost of the game.
I did upgrade my what is it? My RAM.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I'm up to 24 gigs now.
Oh, sweet. You might be able to play it on low graphics, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes quite the difference. I was playing City Skylines and it was taking me about half an hour to load maps. Back when I just had the 8 gigs. So now 24 gigs, just a couple minutes. It's very nice. Strong recommend.
Nice. Oh yeah, chat's also saying there's a nudity warning. You don't have to have the nudity stuff on though. You can turn that off. But it is a very sexual game. The characters will bang each other, and many of the characters will try to romance you or just like have sex with you at camp pretty early on.
So this is a real nerd power fantasy. This game.
This is the ultimate nerd power fantasy game. Yeah, you get to be very strong. You get a team of very sexy people around you who want to bang you. That you have to like navigate the conversations for certain characters, but some of them are just very, you could say, easy, and they come at you. I haven't really got into those situations because the character that my main character is romancing like doesn't do anything with you for apparently a very long time, so I haven't actually seen that stuff that everyone is hyping about, but there have been multiple other characters that try to make advances really early. So people who are into romance in that game, there's tons of that kind of stuff. The combat is also really, really fun. It does feel very strategic in how you balance your team, where you want to have some people who can absorb the damage that you're taking. You want to have some ranged. You need to have some AoE to deal with big clusters of stuff. You need to have crowd control for the big threats on the field. And it's turn-based, so it gives you the time that you need to figure stuff out. So in that sense, it doesn't feel as overwhelming as real-time stuff. So yeah, super good video game, super good mechanics, great story, great characters. It checks all the boxes.
Pretty cool. Can you play a support?
Yes.
Does it actually work?
Yes. Well, if you make your main character a support, you can bring a party member that's a tank or bring a like DPS kind of person. So you can choose who you bring to your party, and you can also customize them as they level up to make them fit more of what you need. And if you play on a low difficulty, it doesn't matter anyway. So for the highest difficulty, you do need a well-balanced team. For the lowest difficulty, you can do whatever you want and you win. Nice. And it's more like enjoying the story.
Yeah, the reason I ask is that the first time I played Pillars of Eternity, I tried to make my main a support character, and didn't work out too well for me, suffice to say. Mm-hmm. So I'm a little wary about starting role-playing games like that as supports now as a result.
Yeah, supports are very strong in this game, because a lot of times you're just buffing another damage class to do more. Like one of my favorite spells, and another bonus, I guess I didn't mention this, Baldur's Gate 3 follows the exact same rule set as Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So
Oh, really?
if you have real life people around who are like, "Hey, do you want to be a part of this D&D campaign?" kind of a thing. And you've played Baldur's Gate, you know what everything is just by virtue of it using all the same rules for when you take a turn, your action, your bonus action, how reactions work, how XP works and leveling up works. It's all exactly the same. It's even like using the Wizards of the Coast copyright and all that kind of stuff. So it's a way to learn D&D without actually playing a tabletop game IRL. So for anyone who's been interested in that but feels intimidated by how much there is to learn, playing Baldur's Gate 3 is the same shit. So yeah, kind of in that vein, someone was asking a non-world question of you, which is, have you played the new Path of Exile League?
Oh, yeah, I heard you guys talking about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never play League actually on Path of Exile. Maybe that means I'm weak, but I've never really gone beyond just the campaign
Mm-hmm.
as far as Path of Exile. For me, it's enough just to build new characters and then go through the campaign and level them up. But I've never done any of the more sort of varied late game type content like the leagues and the PvP and other stuff like that. So I'm very insular, basically, when it comes to video games generally. I'm generally not a big multiplayer guy or a competitive guy.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I really haven't been able to play regardless because, as I mentioned before, up until very recently, I only had 8 gigs of RAM. And Path of Exile started out not having very high requirements, but over the past 10 years, those requirements have been increasing pretty steadily. And so 8 gigs of RAM is not sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't really been back to play it since I upgraded my RAM. I did load it up just to kind of see what difference the RAM made, and sure enough, it did significantly ease gameplay. So if I wanted to, I could probably get back into it, but I just haven't done it yet.
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing other stuff. So lack of opportunity, lack of hardware, and disinterest in League in general kind of has precluded me from doing anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm more a campaign single player play style in general.
Yep, you would like Baldur's Gate then. That's how I've been
Yeah.
playing it. I have 2 solo characters that I've been playing on. One is a sorcerer, one is a ranger. So one of them is like really good with bows and crossbows and stuff, and she can also summon different animal companions. So I can summon a boar that rages and charges and knocks people over, and I can also summon like a crab or a raven, and they can pinch or blind targets. And then the sorcerer just has like strong magic spells, good AoE, and then the thunder sorcerer subclass means that after you cast a ranked spell, you get to fly at the end of that turn, so you can reposition yourself after you cast those like big ticket spells, which is pretty cool. And then I have a duo campaign with my friend Apoptosis, and I'm playing a paladin in that. So I have heavy armor, 2-handed weapon, just really smashing stuff and then healing people as bonus actions on my turns. And he's playing a warlock in that one. So I stand in the front, he stands in the back, and it's been a really good time. When you play with a friend, you can basically split the 4-person party. We have it where I have control of my character and one of the companions, and he has control over his character and the other companion. So the flow is pretty good for that.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah. Also, another comment. Sammy Theth wanted to say that he loves you, and Watch Chris Play said that we've missed you. I've been
Well,
playing
thank you.
Kingdom Death the past 2 weeks on Sunday, so that's why we haven't had.
Oh
good
yeah,
stuff.
that was that board game you were telling me about. How's that been
Yes.
going?
Yes, it's been very good. The new expansion for it came out, so there are a ton of different rules and different models and stuff. It uses a collective consciousness system and a philosophy system and a knowledge system. So how your character changes depends on what that character believes about how the world works. It can be all kinds of different stuff, like maybe they believe that we're already dead and we're living in the afterlife, so nothing matters, and that gives them resistance to damage because they think it's all fake anyway. Stuff like that. And usually those give your character minuses as well, kind of fitting with the dark theme of the game, where if you get a buff from something, you also usually get a nerf from something as well. So yeah, it's been really fun, and they just updated the app for it. So I'll probably play with them with the app next time we game together. But I wanted to get in a world discussion today because it's been a bit. The biggest ticket thing that people have been fussing at me about since, I think Saturday. I bet you can guess it. Actually, let me let you guess it. What is the one headliner news item that you think people are fussing about the most this week?
Oh, God. Let me think. Outbound investment was last week. I don't know. I'm drawing a blank.
Is Prigozhin dead?
Oh, right.
Oh.
Yeah, people love the Prigozhin drama. I haven't paid as much attention to it. I don't think it's going to matter that much as far as broader outcomes in Ukraine. But yeah, I should have guessed that would be the thing that would catch people's attention.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was probably anyway assassinated. That seems to be the consensus opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was starting to think, a lot of people said that it was inevitable that he would be assassinated, but the longer it went without him being killed, I started to wonder if maybe there wasn't some kind of accommodation that had been made, or if maybe Putin just thought he was good enough at managing personal disputes, I guess you might call them, within his extended patronage network, that he could just kind of let it go. Mm-hmm. Putin, and well, not just Putin, but kind of authoritarian type leaders who sit on top of patronage networks, they're kind of used to dealing with outbursts, like generally not that bad, not as bad as an outright mutiny, but having people within your patronage network compete with each other, sometimes violently, that's not unusual in authoritarian political systems. And a lot of dictators kind of almost encourage it, because it kind of gives them a method, it gives them a tool by which to control people. Mm-hmm. If they're fighting with each other, then they're not fighting you. And you can use that to your advantage by ensuring that no one particular faction ever gets too strong. Mm-hmm. So dictators tend to have an inflated sense of their ability to manage disputes like that. And so I kind of got the sense that maybe Putin had that sentiment towards Prigozhin. Maybe he figured that, as egregious as the mutiny may have been, that he could contain it. Prigozhin was not trying to kill Putin. He was trying to usurp the authority of his rivals in the patronage network, specifically the chief of general staff in Russia, or whatever the equivalent of that is, Gerasimov, I think his name is. So that was more who Prigozhin was jockeying with there. Mm-hmm. And it ended up going further than he expected. One of the things I read is that he'd been expecting that Wagner Group would confront forces loyal to Gerasimov, and that there would be some kind of negotiation. And instead, nothing was forthcoming. There was just an open road to Moscow, and he wasn't expecting that. And so that put him in an awkward position where he just kind of had to stop. And when Putin kind of turned on him and made it clear that he was at least in the media was being described as a traitor, that's when Prigozhin really felt like he'd lost that battle. Again, it was an insider battle, not an explicit attempt to change the regime. Mm-hmm. So I thought that maybe that meant that Putin would just kind of let it slide and would use Prigozhin maybe as a kind of stalking horse that would represent leverage over Gerasimov and other competing elites. But it looks like maybe it was the plan was more to just incorporate Wagner Group into the Russian army, at least its European branch anyway. I think the African branch has continued unmolested. But Wagner Group forces in Europe have been steadily integrated into the Russian army. And it seems like they were waiting until that process was further along before making some kind of move. So that's kind of where we are. Although I would point out that's conjecture on my part. Nobody really knows exactly what the rationale was here for assassinating Prigozhin, or why it took so long. And the whole episode was pretty weird. Like, there was a deal by which Prigozhin was going to leave Russia and stay in Belarus along with Wagner Group. But then, like a week later, Prigozhin was running around in Russia. So nobody really knew how to interpret that. It was just very strange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the turn of conversation of, wow, I was really impressed that Putin seemed to be able to just manage the attack on his role and stuff, and do some conflict resolution and not kill the guy, because he would normally just kill the guy. Oh no, he killed the guy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's pretty much what it was. That was my thinking.
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe it wouldn't happen, and then there it went.
Yep.
But it wasn't really that surprising, and again, it's not going to have an impact on the war.
Mm-hmm.
There are other factors that have been driving events there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we haven't done a Ukraine update in a while, so I've got a bit of a backlog there. So we can do that at some point as well. Mm-hmm. But was there anything you wanted to get to in particular, other than, Prigozhin's plane being shot down?
Some headline stuff that I wrote down before we started. One of them was there was a Republican primary debate thing, and just a reminder for people, a lot of times the incumbent candidate doesn't participate in that, but it doesn't mean that they're not running in it. It's just kind of a norm thing of, if you've won the presidential seat before, then you oftentimes don't show up at the next debate, but it doesn't mean you don't care. That's kind of like why Trump wasn't there. I know he wasn't the incumbent president, but I guess because he's been president before, he didn't show up to that. But I don't know what policy-wise was substantive about that conversation, because I know a lot of those presidential quote debates are more so like infomercials, like you said, where it's them kind of showing off their personality and their main talking points, but they don't really get into the nitty-gritty of how you would make something into an actionable plan. It's more so just trying to hype up more of the crowd than the other people who are there.
Yeah, that's exactly what debates, quote unquote, like that are.
Mm-hmm.
And they tend to be more than a little boring. Mm-hmm. If you study political science and the history of politics in the United States, a lot of these debates are pretty bland overall. Mm-hmm. But they're not designed for people like that. The target demographic is very much people who are more casual in terms of their political involvement and mm-hmm. participation. So it's well designed in that sense. People can get engaged, excited by this, that, or the other candidate. And for some guys who are lesser known, just having their name out there is kind of an achievement. There was one of the participants who had to give away gift cards so that he would be allowed in.
What?
Yeah, there's you're supposed to report your campaign contributions, how much money people are giving to your campaign. Uh-huh. And in order to participate in the debate, you have to meet some minimum threshold of campaign donations. And there was one guy who did not quite meet the limit, and so he actually gave out gift cards in exchange for donations in order to artificially boost the number of campaign donations that he had. That's kind of bending the rules, but technically it did move him past the goalposts, so he was able to participate just on that.
I didn't know that was a thing. That's cool.
Yeah, I don't remember his name, which is not good for him, because the whole point of that is to try to get his name out there, but he's just not that memorable. So we'll see if he kind of improves in that regard. But I think the limelight was more on DeSantis and the Indian guy is Ryan Swayamsevic. I can't remember his proper name. I'd have to look it up. But yeah, those two were probably the ones that got the most attention. DeSantis, for all of the wrong reasons, he had a very weak performance from what I read. He was just kind of there. He existed in the same space as everyone else, but beyond that, he did not do anything to distinguish himself. But let me look up that guy's name. Swayamsevic, GOP candidate. Vivek Ramaswamy. There we go. Yeah, he's kind of a populist figure, takes after Trump in some regards. But he's also a little more, well, he's less rambunctious, you might say, than Trump. So he has some Trumpy type positions, especially regarding, Trump being arrested and J6 and all that kind of stuff. But beyond that, he's kind of more optimistic, more bubbly, etc. So he offers a somewhat different aesthetic, albeit still within the Trumpian vein. Probably the funniest guy was Christie. Christie's, I don't know if you know him, he's a former governor of New Jersey, and he's probably one of, if not the most outspoken anti-Trump Republican. Certainly the most high profile. And, being anti-Trump is not like very popular in the Republican milieu right now. So it was kind of notable that he came out so hard against Trump repeatedly, which got him a number of boos from the audience.
Interesting.
But it didn't stop him. So that was at least interesting. It's not going to help his chances. And he's definitely not anywhere the leader of the pack. He's definitely in the bottom tier there. But it's always, entertaining to see him talk and to get, that kind of response. But yeah, other than that, there weren't really any surprises. Nikki Haley didn't really stand out that much. And most of the others were just pretty bland overall. Mike Pence was there for some reason. I don't know what he expects to accomplish there. If my constituents raided my workplace and started chanting that they wanted to hang me, I don't know that I would still want to run. But apparently, Pence is sufficiently ambitious that he's willing to overlook that.
Look, I know you guys said you wanted to kill me, but I'm willing to forgive that.
I'm not sure what his game plan is. A lot of the hardcore Trumpers are still pretty mad at him because they didn't help him with the big plan, whatever that may have been back in 2020. So he doesn't. It seems like Pence's chances are pretty slim. But to his credit, he did show up and kind of make his case. And, he did get some support from the other candidates in terms of his actions on January 6th. His refusal to kind of go along with whatever shenanigans it was that the crowd had in mind that day. So, that was a nice moment, but it passed pretty quickly. They kind of went back at tearing into each other after that. Yeah, still very early in the process, and you've got to think that Trump has the inside track there regardless. So, they can argue with each other all they want, but Trump is, at least according to polling right now, the most likely recipient of the GOP nomination for the upcoming presidential election. So we'll see if anybody can change that, but for now, it's definitely an uphill battle for all these little guys who are trying to run against him. Yeah, Trump basically just has to exist to continue to garner significant support. The fact that he's got all these charges and whatnot has really just been reinforcing his popularity.
Yeah, because that makes him seem like he's against the system if the system is taking issue with him.
Yeah, he can paint himself as a martyr.
Yeah.
And that's been pretty effective. I think the recent joke/drama, the two seem to go together in the 2020s, was his mugshot being released, and then people immediately selling T-shirts to both Democrats and Republicans. A sign of the times, if you like.
Yep. We live in very polarized and aggressive times. One content idea that I had that might be kind of fun is talking with my parents' Christian pastor in South Dakota. And the reason I want to talk to him in particular is because his bearing is a very peaceful one. And he got to meet my girlfriend Trisha when we visited over there, and he was really down to earth and chill. And I know tattoos are not the most traditional Christian friendly thing, so sometimes you can get judged for that, but he was really cool about that and complimented her on those. And he also asked us about Twitch streaming and gaming and things like that. So he seems really chill and down to earth, and he is a pastor for people who are on average very conservative in South Dakota. And I kind of wanted to ask him, just as a leader within the Christian faith over time, of how he's perceived his following and how much they kind of sip this outrage media Kool-Aid, and how he can manage that, or is he into that too? Like, because I feel like there's outrage media being fed to both sides very aggressively, and it can prevent us from finding common ground and just enjoying each other's company if someone is on the opposite political side when it comes to where you vote. But for the vast majority of our day to day, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter for hanging out and sharing a meal and what have you. So, yeah, we've been ingesting a lot of weaponized media recently, and I think that's something that taints both left and right leaning people, and just like finding ways that we can bridge the gap. And also, I wanted to ask him too about how he perceives the Christian political sphere versus the Christian faith itself, because there is a pretty major difference between the message of Christ in being a servant leader and putting others before yourself and being meek and being someone who isn't showing off and that kind of thing, versus how the Christian voter has to decide between these people who are really putting on a show to make it look like they're going to be in their best interests, but it really seems like they're not. Like, the stuff that Trump has said about the Bible is so hilarious. Maybe you could Google that if you haven't looked that up, Chad, but he absolutely seems like someone who will say the words because it'll get him some big clout, but absolutely puts almost no stake in a regular Christian practice of any kind. And I know that's between him and his own, like, spiritual life and between him and God, if you believe in that. But yeah, being able to be a person who follows a faith, but then also be able to identify when someone is using that about you against you for their own power is a really important life skill. So he would be a cool person to talk with about that.
Sounds like an interesting guy.
Yeah. Left-leaning people as well will oftentimes fall into similar hate traps where they'll rate people who are conservative as less intelligent and stuff like that, and just be really across the board degrading and demonizing of others. And that's something that is a very spicy form of content that people like digesting because it makes them feel superior. And if we can admit that of, hey, this content, it makes the other side out to be villains and horrible, and it really removes the complexity and variety within one kind of domain of political opinion. If we can just kind of moderate our views and find the common ground, I think we can do a lot better and hopefully de-radicalize and depolarize ourselves.
And a unicorn.
Yeah.
Don't forget to ask for a unicorn while you're at it. You might as well.
Yeah, true. Also, can we have a unicorn? Thanks. Another random thing that I saw, just kind of scrubbing the headlines real quick, was I don't know if you have anything to add to this, but the Taliban have decided to ban women from their national parks in Afghanistan. So,
yeah, that's kind of been a trend since they took power. You know, they did not immediately crack down on just women existing, basically, in public spaces. And they made some ambiguous promises about maybe kind of sort of letting them continue to exist in public. But, you know, in the years since, they've slowly and gradually implemented new rules and restrictions on the degree of discretion that women have, in so much as they can appear in public. So, you know, there's more guardian requirements now. You know, you can't travel without a guardian. You can't go to school. Yeah, that was a disappointing one. The Taliban had kind of prevaricated and equivocated on that. You know, they said, well, we don't really want women to be educated, but maybe we should let some. And maybe if we segregate the classrooms, maybe if we do this, that. But then eventually the hardliners kind of won that battle. And so they ended up doing a blanket ban. I think that I think they implemented that last year or thereabouts. So they did go with the hardline version of the policy in the end. And that's pretty much what they've been doing since. You know, whatever other avenues or spaces in public that women had are slowly being targeted and removed. I think a couple months ago it was salons were banned. They'd still had salons in which women could kind of go and get their hair done, nails done, whatever, and those are now banned. They can't do that anymore, even. Yeah, so there's been a pretty steady drumbeat of reforms and changes like that
But
out
don't
of
they have to wear
Afghanistan.
coverings anyway?
Well, yeah, they do, but it's not like they have a lot of alternatives, right?
Yeah.
And it's a space where you can kind of hang out with people, meet with people. Your hairdresser, whatnot, and you can go there with your friends, and it's a social space, right? It's what I think urbanists like to call a third space, or whatever that is. Basically, just a space where people can meet and commune
Hmm.
together. And so that's exactly the kind of space that the Taliban don't like, especially, specifically with regard to women. So perhaps it's surprising it took this long. Perhaps it's surprising it took as long as it did for them to eventually target it, but now they have, so it's gone.
Well, I thought that one of the main reasons why they would not do that is because pretty much the entire rest of the world frowns heavily upon that kind of change that makes things as they were long in the past before any sort of women's rights movements. So that's going to mean they're now distancing themselves from the possibility for kind of aid and support as a government.
Yeah, I think the Taliban is the world's leading producer of I don't give a fuck energy. And as such, they don't particularly care about the global community's sentiment on the matter.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty hell bent on imposing their vision of Afghanistan, regardless of international norms. So, yes, it's true that the international community is very opposed to these changes, and it's just as true that the Taliban do not care.
Mm-hmm.
So, they have gone ahead and done so regardless, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future.
Well, so they're consistent in their wickedness and oppression of women.
Yeah. Say what you will about them, you can't say they're not consistent.
Yeah.
So that was sad.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of sad headlines the past month or two.
There was also
Maui?
something about
Oh.
Mali. The Islamic State has something there.
I was going to say Maui, the Hawaiian island, but
No,
yeah,
that was also a thing. Yeah.
yeah, that was. Yeah, West Africa is still kind of popping off. I still don't think there's going to be like a big regional war. I think some people in chat were talking about that last time. It's pretty unlikely. Burkina Faso. Well, there's only two coup governments, right? There's only two military. Is it junta or junta?
Junta, I think.
I want to say junta, but I think
Yeah.
I've heard otherwise too. Anyway, there's two military dictatorships in West Africa that have said that if ECOWAS does intervene into Niger, then they would intervene themselves in order to help Niger defend itself. And so that had some people talking about the possibility of a regional war in West Africa. And it's pretty unlikely, not just because Nigeria itself, or more specifically, Nigeria's legislature, has been pretty hesitant to actually commit to an intervention. There's also the fact that Burkina Faso and Mali, the two military dictatorships in question, really do not have the capacity to project force into Niger sufficient to actually help it in the event of a conflict.
Mm.
That has to do not just with the small size of their economies and military budgets, but also with the fact that their military forces are mostly preoccupied right now just trying to contain very active insurgencies. Those insurgencies were the very reason that the military actors that now lead those countries seized power in the first place, because the previous governments had made insufficient progress in defeating those insurgencies, thereby delegitimizing the previous government and leaving some room for maneuver for ambitious actors of one sort or the other. So they seized power, claiming that they would be better disposed and better capable of dealing with the insurgencies. They have not. They have not done much differently as far as the insurgencies, other than asking, Russian mercenaries to come in to help them. But that hasn't really changed facts on the ground much.
Mm.
I think the most relevant statistic here is that Burkina Faso, specifically the government of Burkina Faso, only controls about 60% of their territory. 40% is controlled by this, that, or the other insurgent group.
Mm.
So if a country's army is not sufficiently strong to prevent insurgents from seizing 40% of the country, you can maybe forgive me for being a little skeptical that they've got enough forces left over to go intervene in another state's affairs.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably not going to happen. So Mali is not in a much better position. They haven't lost as much territory as Burkina Faso has to insurgents, but their military is just as bogged down dealing with them. So in the event of an ECOWAS intervention, probably a lot of this talk about Mali and Burkina Faso intervening to counter it is probably just cheap talk.
Mm-hmm.
That's my assessment at this point. So probably not going to be a big regional war in all likelihood. In fact, there may not even be an intervention. There's some political resistance to that, even inside of Nigeria, which nominally wants to do it. At least the executive branch wants to do it. Again, the legislature, not so gung-ho, given Nigeria's own problems with insurgents and bandits and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll see. The West has expressed interest in trying to undo the change in Niger's government. So even if Nigeria maybe doesn't have the funds or the expertise or the resources generally for an intervention, they may find that their war chest suddenly overflowing if they do decide to go with the intervention.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very much up in the air right now. I think the last thing I read about it is that ECOWAS had mobilized an intervention force and put it on standby. So nominally, there's a force ready to intervene. It's not clear how big it is or if it'll be sufficient. But they at least do have that sort of Damocles hovering over the head of the new Niger elite that has seized power. Yeah, all of the talk I've heard from Nigeria kind of indicates that they would really, really prefer a negotiated settlement of some kind. They very clearly are not that interested in a military confrontation. That said, they don't want to just walk away with nothing to show for it. They do want to try to undo this precedent, by which militaries can just seize power and install themselves. That is a problem for them, not just because that's, undemocratic, but also because that's a threat to established status quo leaders of one sort or another. They don't like that precedent. Overthrowing established leaders, bad precedent if you're an established leader. So they do want to do something about it. But it's just not clear how far they're willing to go. Clearly, given Nigeria's own problems, they've got bigger fish to fry. Mm-hmm. So there's been a lot of talk about a negotiated settlement, and Nigeria has heaped sanctions, of one kind or another. They've tried to limit the export of food, and particularly rice, I think, into Niger in order to try to pressure the Niger government to commit themselves to new elections, if not the outright restoration of the previous leader that was overthrown. And of course, like I said, the ECOWAS force was put on standby, so they also have that as a point of leverage. So we'll see if that'll be enough. I don't think people are very optimistic right now that there's going to be a negotiated settlement. The general in charge of Niger right now has made it very apparent that he's not interested in negotiations and has been issuing lots of demands that sanctions be removed and that Nigeria normalize relations. So a lot of intransigence there from a guy who is not perhaps in the strongest position. We'll see how that works out for him.
Remind me, what are the countries in ECOWAS again?
Oh, a geography challenge. All right, let's see if I can do this. It's basically all of West Africa. So Nigeria, Togo, Benin, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast, if you prefer. They actually officially changed their name to Cote d'Ivoire. So even if you're an English speaker, you're supposed to call it Cote d'Ivoire. They went out of their way to make that their official name in all venues. So you can't technically call it Ivory Coast. That is technically incorrect. Mm-hmm. But that is what it translates to in English. Anyway, side note. Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Mali, Chad, Niger, maybe I don't think Mauritania is a member. I'd have to look, but I don't think they are. Did I say Burkina Faso? In case I didn't mention it already.
Yeah.
Let's see, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, I think might be in it. That's another edge case. I'm not sure if that's true, but I think they are. I think that's all of them. Niger, Chad, Mali. Yeah, I'm gonna say that's all. Maybe I'm missing some, but I think those are the main. I think that's all of them. How did I do?
I think pretty well. I didn't double check them in again, but yeah,
You
for
got me
a
curious.
refresh, we hear about NATO all the time, but we don't hear about ECOWAS very often in the U.S. anyway.
Let's see. Benny, Niger. Oh, yeah. Mauritania is not in it. Neither is Cameroon. Okay, so I got those wrong. But, oh, I did forget some. Senegal and Gambia. That's right. And those are some important ones, too. I shouldn't have forgotten them. Yeah, Senegal is important because their capital, Dakar, is a big financial center in West Africa. Gambia is not really that important in the grand scheme of things. Gambia barely qualifies as a country. It's a very weird-looking country if you ever see it on a map.
Why does it barely count?
I mean, it is an independent state, internationally recognized, all that, but it's just really small, and it has a very strange shape. Gambia is basically just both banks of a small river. It's very much a result of colonialism. You can kind of tell.
Gotcha.
It shows on the map. It is a very artificial-looking country. But because it's so tiny, it really doesn't have any heft internationally. And it's actually completely surrounded by Senegal, except it does have a small coast, but other than that, it's surrounded on three sides by Senegal. So the relationship with Senegal is pretty important to them. Senegal probably could annex them pretty easily if they really wanted to, but as is, it hasn't really been worth the effort. In addition to being small and weird looking, Gambia also doesn't really have any resources. So it's not really a big player in the region, suffice to say. But yeah, they are ECOWAS members as well. So I mentioned two that were not in it, and I forgot two that were. There we go. So maybe a B minus then.
Better than I would have done for that one.
Well, I mean, it's West Africa, right? How many people bother learning about West Africa?
Yeah,
it's pretty marginal in international affairs, right?
Yeah, Western African countries wasn't a course that I took in school. Nigeria is one of the new players in the game, too, in terms of high population and major economic driver.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. That is a large country. If they can make it through the 2020s, they'll probably be a regional power, if not more. But that's kind of in doubt. The 2020s have not been kind to Africa. So it's anything goes right now. Long-term forecasts are not a thing. Nobody really knows what's going to happen at this juncture. Actually, since we're talking about Africa, did you know that there's another war brewing in Ethiopia?
No.
Yeah, that's the new thing. Yeah, the fighting with the Tigrayans stopped, a year and a half ago, thereabouts, when they signed the peace deal. So the Tigray War is over. But now there's potentially another war brewing with a different region. This time it's Amhara. And, to be fair, the violence didn't fully stop after the peace deal. The violence did stop in Tigray, but Ethiopia had other problems with other restive ethnic groups, specifically the Oromo, ironically. So that's the largest ethnic group, and technically there's an ethnic Oromo in office as president, but that has not sufficed for ethno-nationalist Oromo who continue to perpetrate acts of terrorism and other violence against both rival ethnic groups and the government. So that's kind of been a ebb and flow. That's kind of been ongoing for several years now, and the government has been trying to contain it. But Amhara is a different animal, right? In the Tigray War, the Amhara state the provincial government, I should say. The provincial government of Amhara and its state militia were allied with the government forces and fought with them in the war. But afterwards, there was a falling out, and that had to do with the terms of the peace deal that was signed with the Tigray. Basically, there were no changes to the border between the province of Tigray and the province of Amhara. Both of them border each other, and that was a concession by the government to the Tigray in order to get them to sign on to the peace deal. But it was a concession that the Amharas did not appreciate. The ethnic Amhara community had been participating in the conflict, not just because it was partly their duty as patriotic Ethiopians to put down a separatist rebellion, but also they had been doing it in order to basically try to acquire disputed territory that was held by the Tigrayans. This is territory that Amharans have claimed for a long time and had not really been able to try and get, owing to their, being part of the same country. Provinces don't generally go to war with each other, but there was an opportunity when the Tigrayans revolted, or more accurately, when the Tigrayan leadership revolted. That's a whole discussion unto itself. We can save that for later if anybody's interested. But the Amharas were very disappointed when the peace deal did not grant them any kind of territorial gains. And so that has now resulted in escalating violence in recent months between ethno-nationalist Amhara militiamen and government forces in the region. And the government has started to retaliate. So for now, it's not an outright war. And the Amhara state government hasn't really given much indication that it's interested in the war, but the violence is escalating and there is potential for a tit-for-tat spiral into a general conflict.
Ethiopia's still looking pretty wild.
Yeah, unfortunately so. They've had a rough period. I was kind of hoping after the Tigrayans laid down arms, maybe they would have some peace and quiet, and they could get back to developing their state and their economy. They had been doing pretty well economically before all the conflict started, and the pandemic, and the locusts. It's been a lot of problems in Ethiopia past 5 years. But, before that, they were doing pretty decent, and I was kind of hoping when things finally calmed down, there would be some improvements. But, yeah, it seems like it's just one thing after another.
Mm-hmm. And they were one of the countries that never got colonized by European countries?
Correct. Ethiopia was never colonized, unless you want to count the 30s, which was kind of, yeah, Italy invaded and conquered Ethiopia, but they didn't do it until the 1930s. And they were only there for, 10 years? It was like mid-late 30s when they did it, and then at the end of World War II, actually, before that. Yeah, because the British kicked the Italians out of Ethiopia early in World War II. But the war started in 1939, and I think the British were able to basically seize all of Italy's African possessions by the end of 1940, I want to say. Somebody can correct me on that if I'm wrong in chat, but I believe that's the case. So Italy's occupation of Ethiopia lasted from roughly 36, I want to say, up until 1940. So they did technically colonize it, but it wasn't for very long. So Ethiopia, I think, can be said to be in the very small club of nations that were never colonized. But there's an asterisk on their record.
Except for that one time.
Except for that one time. Well, keep in mind also that that was not the first time Italy had tried to colonize Ethiopia. Italy had actually tried to invade and conquer Ethiopia around the turn of the century. What was it? It was like the 1890s or like 1910, something around there. And the invasion failed spectacularly. It was one of the rare cases of a European army in the period being repulsed by native resistance. Yeah, it was a pretty impressive episode for the Ethiopians. Very embarrassing for the Italians. Not a good look for them at the time.
No.
So you got to give the Ethiopians credit on that count.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, Africa is pretty happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. perhaps somewhat ironically, given the history, one of the best performing countries in Africa right now is Rwanda.
Hmm.
They're doing very well. To have one of the fastest growing economies over the past 20 years. Pretty stable. Um, Comes with a price. They do kind of have a dictatorship. It's not a full dictatorship, but more of like a autocracy sort of situation. But if you're going to have an authoritarian government, obviously you would rather not. But if you are going to have one, you would prefer that it be an enlightened dictatorship and not like a super corrupt, self-interested one.
Mm-hmm.
And Rwanda has been fortunate in that their particular dictator, I believe his name is Paul Kagame, has been relatively enlightened in the grand scheme of things. So he's done a pretty decent job of growing the economy, state building, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And they have some pretty recognizable, notable gains to show for it now. Yeah, that whole Great Lakes region continues to do pretty well. Tanzania, Kenya, to a lesser degree, Uganda and Burundi, but the whole region is probably one of, if not the most stable in Africa. So props to them, for making it through. But they're kind of an outlier at this point, unfortunately. North Africa obviously pretty messy, given Libya. That's still that's pretty anarchic still. It's not as bad as it used to be. Things have kind of settled down. There's not like open conventional warfare like there was a couple of years ago when Haftar was pushing on the capital, Tripoli. But still much less violence than there had been. And then Egypt has basically gone full totalitarian at this point, so obviously that's not great either. The economy is not in great condition either, for that matter.
Is it still Muslim Brotherhood that's in control there?
Oh no, not even. It's the military.
Oh yeah, the military took over again.
Yeah. They threw him out. The Muslim Brotherhood was only in power for like a year or two. It was not very long. Yeah, the army came back pretty quickly, which was very unnecessary. The Muslim Brotherhood was already losing a lot of popularity. Their president was suffering from significant ridicule online. So if there had been another election, there's a very real probability that they would have just lost anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But the army was not interested in an election. They were interested in an excuse to restore their stranglehold on the nation's politics. So they launched a coup that was popular at the time in order to seize control and, quote unquote, save the country. That was the excuse at the time. That support has significantly waned since then. It's pretty obvious to everybody that they didn't really care about saving the country. They just wanted the country back,
mm-hmm.
which they have. And once they had it back, they cracked down hard. Egypt under, what's his name, Al-Sisi, the current dictator, is more authoritarian now than it was before the Arab Spring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Before, dissent was crushed, police were corrupt, but, there was space for civil society and some dissent. Under Al-Sisi, none of that. They straight up just disappear people for criticizing the government now.
Damn.
Yeah. So they're leaning heavily towards the totalitarian side of the political spectrum at this point. So Libya, Egypt, not great. Algeria and Morocco, much better and pretty stable, relatively competent. I think Algeria has, Algeria could do if it would just move beyond its elderly leadership. The last guy was particularly egregious. He was like 100 years old, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, he was way up there.
So
and
like
it was
an
obvious.
American president.
Yeah, he had him by a decade or so. Yeah, I can't remember his name. I think it started with a B, but regardless, he had been president before, but it was obvious that he wasn't in control of anything. The FMLN, which was like the revolutionary party that achieved independence. They fought the French in the War of Independence back in the 1960s. They took power after they gained independence and basically just set up an authoritarian one-party state. Like you do. Not uncommon amongst newly independent states in Africa, if not the world generally. But the party has propped up this one guy, or had been propping up this one guy as president, basically a token figurehead. And rather than finding somebody younger or new to do the job, they just kept using him. He was, even when the guy was in his 90s, up to 100 years old, and they had to wheel him around in a wheelchair, and it was just very obvious that he was out of it. I know people like to make fun of Joe Biden, but this guy was the real deal. This guy was obviously already mentally retired, and they were just using his body, basically. That's how bad it was. So he's gone, which is a nice change, but the party elite, the FMLN, they're still in power, and they haven't really changed anything. So they are keeping the country stable, which is nice, especially for North Africa. But beyond that, they haven't really progressed much economically or politically. And Tunisia also in North Africa. They've also been struggling. Yeah, the whole Kais Saied thing is disappointing. If you've been following Tunisia, you kind of recognize that they had set up one of the few successful democracies in the wake, well, pretty much the only successful effort to set up a democracy in the wake of the Arab Spring. And since then, successive governments have struggled to kind of achieve any kind of consensus by which they could implement a program to actually substantively address the country's problems, specifically economics. The country's economy has not done well over the past 10 years since the Arab Spring. But the government has been at pains to do anything about it. And people got sufficiently desperate that they basically voted in an autocrat. He was kind of a populist type figure. He was not actually the populist figure in the election that he won. There was a lot of talk about Tunisians having a choice between a populist and a reformer. And Kais Saied was actually the reformer. The populist guy was some shit talker of some guy. I don't remember his name. It's been too long. But there was some relief amongst the pro-democracy crowd that Tunisians had elected Saied instead of the populist guy. And then Saied went full populist. He put pressure on the legislature to kind of bend to his whim. He unilaterally pushed a referendum to pass a new constitution that granted the executive sweeping new powers. So yeah, there's been a lot of regression there in Tunisia, unfortunately. The only upshot there is that people are starting to sour on Saied. He's been in power for several years now, and despite having his way with the government in terms of solidifying his hold on power, he hasn't actually substantively addressed any of the big problems, including the economic problems that were mostly responsible for getting elected in the first place. So people are souring on him. There's more institutional resistance. Unions have turned on him. The legislature is trying to turn on him in so much as it can. He actually dissolved the legislature a couple of years ago. So the legislature says it still exists and that it doesn't like him. And he says, no, it doesn't exist. I don't have to listen to you. Such is politics in an authoritarian political system.
If you don't believe in a legislature, can they still hurt you?
Well, refer to Tunisia. There's a natural experiment there by which you can find out. So North Africa has its problems. Obviously, West Africa has its problems. East Africa doing okay, other than the Horn anyway. Obviously, the Horn of Africa is like a hot dumpster fire at this point. Ethiopia has its problems, but Somalia is much worse. Somalia continues to be very anarchic. There's been some optimism there. There's kind of an ongoing effort to train up counterterrorism forces, and there was a broad loss of public support in al-Shabaab controlled areas for the al-Shabaab. And so the government launched an offensive trying to take advantage of that. Gains have not really been as great as hoped in that regard. So fighting is ongoing. But we'll see what the new counterterrorism units can do. Regardless, very messy. Also, there's been fighting in Somaliland even. So I was reading. That was very disappointing. Yeah, I don't know how much you know about Somaliland, but they were one of the bright spots in Africa. They're actually not an internationally recognized government. They're not recognized as independent. They had been part of Somalia, But when the Somali government collapsed in the early 1990s, the northwesternmost province of Somalia, that being Somaliland, actually just declared its independence and broke away. And they've been on their own ever since. And they had actually done a pretty decent job of setting up a fairly functional government. A lot of new governments in Africa get bogged down in infighting between different elites, and the result is ethnic conflict, tribal conflict, civil war, just sort of violence generally. But the elites in Somaliland actually got together, agreed on a form of government in which everybody kind of had some stake and voice, and the result has been a fairly peaceful political culture, which again, not that common. It's not entirely uncommon. It's not like you can't see other countries in Africa that have something similar, but Somaliland, as a country that declared independence and broke away from a failed state, surprisingly did really well. Really surpassed expectations as far as their ability to form a new government and a new stable political culture that did not utilize violence to resolve issues between competing interest groups. So a lot of people really like Somaliland for that. Even governments liked Somaliland. Obviously, if you're the U.S. government and you're concerned about terrorism and instability, you appreciate having a bastion of stability in the region. Still refrained from extending recognition just because it would have complicated basically diplomatic relations with Somalia, Ethiopia, etc. It was kind of problematic diplomatically. That's a whole conversation unto itself. But basically, Washington supported Somaliland but could not, or at least felt it could not, extend recognition. And that lasted, stability in Somaliland was always kind of on tenuous ground. Obviously, it's in a volatile region. And, even though relations between elites in the country were fairly peaceful, there were incidents of disagreement. Some people complained about tribalism being disproportionately important in elections. Some people complained about voter fraud, corruption, etc. Those are kinds of problems everywhere, but in Somaliland in particular, they seem to be under control. But what happened this past year is that a ethnic minority group that's on the border between Somaliland and Puntland, which is a part of Somalia, but is kind of a semi-autonomous part of Somalia, basically kind of like the Somaliland provincial government. The provincial government of Puntland, again, a province of Somalia, after the Somali government collapsed, basically just continued to run its affairs as though nothing had happened. So, similar to Somaliland in that they were able to avoid a complete breakdown of authority, like most of Somalia, but different than Somaliland in that Puntland did not declare independence. They still considered themselves a part of Somalia, even though they did not actually have a national government to report to. Kind of an odd arrangement. So Puntland is to the east of Somaliland, and there's an ethnic minority group that kind of straddles both territories. And they've kind of chafed against the governments of both, but in the past year, discontent escalated to the point of violence, and they launched a general uprising to try to throw out the Somaliland government and achieve their own independent government. And the Somaliland government obviously responded with force, but has not either really been that interested in a negotiated settlement. The sentiment seems to be that this rebellion is illegal and that the government is well within its rights to try to suppress it. And so the result has been almost exclusively a military approach to resolve the issue. So, not surprising, rebellions are going to be met with force by governments, but one would have hoped that they would have been smarter about it, basically, taken a more diplomatic approach in a conjunction with the use of military force. If you're only ever using military force, you're doing it wrong. You do need to have a balance between the iron fist and the velvet glove.
Yeah.
If you go too hard, then you're basically just ensuring that there's going to be conflict again in the future at some point.
Live by the sword, die by the sword.
Yeah. So it's much better to try to achieve some kind of concord with local elites that are resisting you so that you can lay the groundwork for peace later on in the long term. But that doesn't seem to be what they're doing. So even Somaliland now is experiencing some violence. But yeah, that's East Africa, Horn of Africa, a mess. Great Lakes region, pretty strong. And then there's Southern Africa, and yeah, that's an interesting one. That's an interesting region. It's, I mean, it's not war torn, right? People think of Africa as being torn by civil wars, warlords, smuggling, failed states, and really, that's only like very specific pockets of Africa. Some of those pockets have been growing lately, but in general, most of Africa is not that bad.
Mm-hmm.
And Southern Africa kind of exemplifies that. It's not that bad. Democratic Republic of Congo, kind of borderline failed state almost. It's the state is much stronger in the west of the country than the east of the country. Let's put it like that. There's some regional variance there in state capacity. But the Civil War is over. We're kind of past the Congo Wars period. When there was basically a giant World War I style conflagration in the middle of Africa. It's not really like that anymore. Occasionally violence does flare up, but overall things are much more predictable now in DR Congo.
Mm-hmm.
And you can kind of say similar for the rest of the region in Southern Africa. Like nobody's really doing great. I don't think anybody except maybe Botswana can really be said to be overachieving at this point. Uh, but it's not violent and war torn either. It's just sort of a comfortable, predictable malaise of government corruption and inefficiency.
That doesn't sound like the best advertisement for a government.
Well, yeah, if you're comparing Southern Africa to like Europe, sure, it doesn't really compare well. But if you're comparing it to Somalia, that's not bad. That's pretty good.
Hmm.
And given that it's more Somalia that sets Western expectations of Africa than the more successful states of Africa, it is relevant. That is telling that Southern Africa is able to exceed those very low expectations.
Hmm.
They could do a lot better. Corruption in South Africa in particular has just absolutely hobbled the economy. And obviously, Zimbabwe's economic travails are well advertised at this point. They're still experiencing hyperinflation. The crocodile won re-election. That's the nickname of the guy that overthrew Robert Mugabe and seized power a couple years ago. So they just had an election, and unsurprisingly, he won. It was never going to be a free election, so nobody's surprised by the outcome. People had high hopes for him when he took power. It was hoped that he would improve the economy and at least stabilize the currency, but hasn't happened. Some token efforts have been made, but they have not been successful. So Zimbabwe continues to be something of an economic basket case, correspondingly. So, Zimbabwe, not great. That's probably the worst performing state in the region at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Mozambique could give them a run for their money. But the thing about Mozambique is that the instability is very region specific. The south of Mozambique is much more stable than the north. The north is still kind of Wild West. They've got Islamic State affiliated jihadis running around up there, blowing up gas pipelines and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But the further south you get, the more stable things get. Although it's worth mentioning that things never really normalized after the Civil War ended. So they kind of had a low bar as far as stability. But in general, the whole country is not a mess, just, significant parts of it. So Zimbabwe, Mozambique, kind of the laggards. South Africa, definitely underperforming, but not that bad. Botswana doing very well. Botswana always kind of does well. A lot of that is just on the back of diamond mining. Botswana has one of, if not the highest GDP per capita in all of Africa. But a lot of that is just because there's significant mining of diamonds in the country, and also because the population is so small. So, big giant mining industry plus small population invariably equals large GDP per capita. It's kind of a numbers trick. As Mark Twain said, lies, damned lies, and statistics. So Botswana kind of exemplifies that to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
But to their credit, actually, their government has not really abused that windfall from natural resources. The government in Botswana is generally credited at being one of the less corrupt and more efficient in Africa. So they have somewhat miraculously managed to matrix dodge the resource curse that afflicts so many countries in Africa. Maybe they won't keep it up forever, but they have for the past couple decades. That's not to say they don't have their problems. They do, but in general, Botswana definitely exceeds expectations. So Botswana definitely kind of leader of the pack in the region in that regard. Yeah, Namibia is just a kind of a desert, so it doesn't really count. I mean, it's very stable. The government isn't that bad, but there's just not much going on there. I think the whole country has a population of like 500,000 people, despite the fact that it's almost the size of the entire west coast of the United States. So, yeah, it's not necessarily that big an achievement. There's not really much trouble the government can get in when it lacks significant resources with which to work with. I think the most recent thing I read about Namibia was that Germany is going to try to build a whole bunch of solar power plants down there so that they can produce green hydrogen. That's a whole other. I don't think we've talked at length about it, but green hydrogen is a major industrial policy objective for many, many governments around the world right now.
Wanting to use hydrogen fuel?
Yeah, actually, that's pretty much it. For one, there's kind of a push to try to get them in cars, to have hydrogen-fueled cars. That may or may not work. From what I've read and heard things that suggest that's probably not going to happen, actually. It's just not really economically viable. So that may not be feasible. But even so, there's still significant interest because hydrogen actually could act as a substitute for natural gas and oil in certain industrial applications. And so if you have a large industrial economy like Germany does, the prospect of replacing oil and natural gas, or at least a lot of oil and natural gas, with green hydrogen is pretty attractive. Not just because of the environmental implications, but also because of the fact that it's basically going to be impossible to transition, to do the green transition without committing economic suicide for a large industrial economy anyway, without finding some kind of substitute for oil and natural gas. So Germany is very heavily betting on hydrogen as that substitute so that they can continue to prop up their traditional economic model, which again is very focused on heavy industry, which is very energy intensive.
Well, I am somewhat of an expert on hydrogen fuel because when I was in 6th grade, I did a middle school science class report on hydrogen fuel as a potential option. And you're right, one of the main reasons why it's not a thing for cars is because you have to cool the hydrogen. So you'd basically need a big ass freezer / refrigerator item that's in the vehicle keeping that hydrogen at a usable temperature, because if it's room temperature, it's a gas, not a solid, and that's not really what you want for hydrogen fueling situations. So yeah, for industrial type stuff, it's a lot more feasible to have like one area where you're using the hydrogen fuel, and then you have one big refrigerating item. But for each individual vehicle, that makes it a lot less tenable as an option. So that makes sense. But yeah, as chat pointed out, the byproduct of hydrogen is water. So if you're using hydrogen as fuel, you have the hydrogen, you oxidize it, combust it, that mixes it with oxygen, H2O. So it's a very low waste as an option. That's the upshot of it. The downside is you have to keep the hydrogen cool all the time.
Yeah, I watched a YouTube video from by a professor of some kind. I don't remember her name, but yeah, she gave a whole critique about hydrogen-powered cars and their prospects. And she didn't mention the freezing thing. That's interesting. I'm going to try to remember that. But what she did mention is that basically the kind of hydrogen batteries that people want to make for hydrogen-powered cars, because they're basically just battery-powered cars using hydrogen. And part of the problem is that you have to condense the hydrogen significantly. So, kind of similar to what you were talking about, but specifically because hydrogen is a gas, and you have to compress it to the point that the batteries are under an immense amount of pressure, which is a problem because apparently hydrogen is very corrosive. And so you have to make the interior of the container out of a very, very strong corrosive resistant material, both to be able to contain the immense pressure and also to resist the corrosion of the hydrogen. And
Hmm.
apparently that makes the cost of producing the batteries very expensive. Like it's basically cost prohibitive in order to do that.
Yeah, we have a
Yeah.
lot of those. This is kind of a general frontier, expanding the conversation beyond just hydrogen fuel, but different, more environmentally friendly options usually have some reason why they're not the mainstay right now, due to cost. An
Yeah.
example that comes to mind is lab grown meat is another thing that is like an ethical slash potential environmental thing. But the current cost of a lab grown meat burger, I think, is something like $65 or whatever. So it's pretty far off being a like feasible purchasable item for your average everyday consumer. So we do need quite a few different scientific breakthroughs to make a lot of the green ideas for energy use and consumption better. But there are
Yeah.
very smart people working on all those different problems. So,
Oh yeah, they'll get there eventually. If we don't all die first,
yep.
given time. I'm fully confident that we can produce the prerequisite technology. Yeah, but for now, it's just challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Given technological limitations. Yeah. Wait. How did? Okay. Green hydrogen. Namibia. That's what it was.
Yeah,
Okay.
they're working on hydrogen. You're like, how did we get here?
Yeah, I was trying to backtrace it. Yeah, so Namibia and Germany have been cooperating recently. So again, Namibia is just a big giant desert, basically. So Germany wants to build power plants, solar power plants, which they can use to then power the electrolysis process by which green hydrogen is produced, and then that hydrogen can then be exported back to Germany for use in German industry. So that could work. That's got some people talking about quote unquote green colonialism, basically by which Germany is exploiting natural resources in Namibia for their own benefit. Um, I'm pretty dubious about that. That seems like they're kind of stretching it more than a little bit. But there is some truth to that, I guess. But anyway, the point is Namibia is relatively stable. Yeah, that was kind of the main point I was driving at.
Mm.
So that's kind of a mid tier. I didn't mean to do like a tier ranking of Southern African countries, but I guess that's what this turned into. But yeah, let's. Namibia and South Africa are kind of like mid tier as far as stability and
Mm.
economy goes. Zimbabwe, Mozambique, definitely bottom tier. Botswana, definitely top tier, S tier, if you like.
Mm.
Angola is kind of like between Botswana and everybody else. They do pretty well, but a lot of that is just because of the oil revenue. Angola is one of the top producing oil countries in the world. It's like top 10 or so. So
Mm.
they bring in a whole bunch of revenue. So that kind of eases over a lot of difficulties. The government is authoritarian, but no surprise. That's pretty much what you would expect. They actually do better than the other former Portuguese colony, Mozambique, does. So you got to give them some credit for that. But also, there just hasn't been a lot of investment in the broader public welfare. Unlike Botswana's government, they have not really reinvested natural resource revenues into the public, such that there's been gains to human capital that could translate into a broader advancement of the overall economy.
Mm.
So the country is stable. The government is corrupt, but not crazy corrupt. But the downside is that the government is sufficiently self-interested to basically preclude the country's development beyond basically current levels. They do invest in themselves. The elite do invest in like Luanda, the capital of Angola. So Luanda is very pretty now.
Mm.
It's probably one of the best looking capitals in Africa. Also, one of the most expensive cities in the world, somewhat counterintuitively. I
Interesting.
don't think, yeah, people don't think of Africa as having really expensive cities, but in a major oil producer like Angola, they actually do.
Did
So
not know
buy
that.
Luanda real estate if you can. I guess there's some other countries in the region like Lesotho and Swaziland, but they're so small that they're basically micro states.
Mm.
And so nobody really pays much attention to them. Zambia is doing okay. Zambia is kind of another mid-tier country. They could do a lot better if the government would stop screwing around. But overall, it's not that bad. They do technically have a democracy. They even had a election overturned. Yeah, they had an election in which widespread fraud was alleged. It was then proven in court, and then the government, well, the court system basically overthrew the result of the election and ordered a new one. And then the opposition was able to win the new election. So that's pretty laudable. You got to give them credit for that. Yeah, still pretty corrupt, still exceedingly poor, still lots of problems. But as far as democracy goes, Zambia actually does pretty well for itself. So points on politics for Zambia. Yeah, so again, I'm just trying to illustrate a broader picture here of Southern Africa. Anyway, it's not super violent. It's just not very successful either. Again, just sort of comfortable, corrupt malaise. It's probably the best description. Not that bad, but could be better. East Africa, specifically the Great Lakes region, doing pretty well. That's like the upper bound of what you can probably expect. And then everybody else is kind of just getting screwed by a combination of climate change, instability, jihadi violence, and other factors, poor economic performance, what have you.
Well, speaking of corruption, kind of rating those, I saw there were multiple posts about Zelensky making different intentions or promises about cutting down on Ukrainian corruption. And just to kind of review what corruption is, that's basically when, as money is passing through, people take a piece for themselves rather than directing it fully to the institution that it was intended for, and how that can be more of a norm in certain countries where corruption is more common, and they don't even think of it as bad because they think of that as like part of your pay in a sense.
Yeah, an entitlement.
Yeah. So what is their situation? Do you know if their corruption level has gotten better since the war started, or it's kind of the same as it has been?
Well, cultures change slowly, so I doubt there's been a whole lot of change, but the Zelensky government has been making pretty significant efforts to try to clamp down on it. A lot of that just has to do with the war effort. If you're in a life or death struggle for sovereignty, you really don't want to mess around as far as people selling weapons or taking bribes, that kind of stuff, because that does hobble the war effort. So a lot of this is basically the formation of the state, right? As the old saying in international relations goes, war is the health of the state. Historically speaking, in Europe anyway, if not the broader world, wars have been a major impetus for the development of state capacity and the centralization of state authority. So the construction of the modern state was very much, at least in part, in European history, forged in warfare, of which there's been quite a bit in Europe's history. So there's a similar phenomena going on now in which the Ukrainian state, which had long kind of taken a pretty lax approach to dealing with corruption, really the elites that controlled Ukraine were themselves corrupt oligarchs, and they didn't really have much incentive to give the Ukrainian state the authority to crack down on corruption. That wouldn't have made much sense from the perspective of the oligarchs. But since there's a de facto nationalist in power now, Zelensky, who has been granted wartime authority, he's been taking that and running with it. And he's been making pretty strong efforts here and there, mostly in terms of personnel changes and not tolerating corruption where previous leaders probably would have. As the old saying goes, the fish rots from the head. That's an old saying in English. Basically, the idea there being that a lot of corruption just stems from top-level corruption from the major leaders. So Zelensky, just by trying not to be corrupt and actively punishing people who are, that itself is a pretty significant change. Again, it's not going to produce significant results in the short term, because again, it's an ingrained cultural mindset in Ukraine's political culture, but they are moving in the right direction, and they are moving much more quickly than they have been before the war. And again, wartime exigencies expedite everything. It's going to significantly contribute to the formation of a new Ukrainian state of some kind. What it looks like in practice, we won't really know until the war is over. But for now, this is very much the formation. Right now we're very much witnessing in real time the creation of a new Ukrainian state, as well, I might add, as a new Ukrainian identity. Ukrainian national identity had been kind of fuzzy historically. Centuries of Russian colonialism will do that. That's not that surprising, all the more so given the linguistic and cultural similarities and affinities between Russians and Ukrainians. So when Ukraine became independent, there were people, especially in the western part of the country, that had a very strong sense of national identity, but there was a lot of people who did not. Especially a lot of ethnic Russians living more in the east. They kind of still had more affinity for the Russian identity and the Russian state. And there was a lot of people that were kind of somewhere in between. A lot of people, most people in Ukraine speak both Ukrainian and Russian and kind of code switch between them depending on who they talk to.
And
So, Russian,
are they mutually intelligible? Like if a Ukrainian person speaks Ukrainian at a Russian person, the Russian person pretty much understands what they're saying?
I don't believe they are mutually intelligible.
Oh.
That's my understanding right now. There are similarities, and there are a lot of Russian loan words in Ukrainian, especially in terms of technical terms, technology, generally more modern stuff, generally has more of a Russian origin, but overall, like in terms of grammar, syntax, etc., they're not mutually intelligible. That's my understanding. Please correct me if I'm wrong in chat. Actually, let me do the usual disclaimer before I forget. We're already pretty deep in. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, more painful at some times than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation from chat is encouraged in that regard.
Looks like we have someone with Ukraine as part of their Twitch name, and they said that Ukrainians understand Russian, but not the other way around. I'll give a reply question. Why is that? I'm not doubting. I'm just curious.
Well, I would be interested in the answer too. I've heard of similar dynamics in Scandinavia, because I think the way it works is that Norwegians can understand Swedish, but Swedes do not understand Norwegian. It's kind of a weird situation there linguistically.
Yeah, they have a lot of their own like kind of silly ways of explaining how people talk. I think it was a Swede who was telling me that they can understand Danish people, but they sound like they have a cantaloupe in their mouth, just with how they pronounce different stuff. So I think there's like less of a sharp emphasis on things. So yeah, it's interesting how a lot of these languages have commonality between them. Obviously, lots of shared words if they're from the same language family and that kind of thing. But yeah, they're not all necessarily mutually intelligible. Some words are universal, such as bliet. Yep, even American gamers know that word.
Yeah, granted. But yeah, getting back to anti-corruption, well, I was making the point, we're not just witnessing the formation of a new Ukrainian state, we're also seeing the formation of a new Ukrainian national identity. It kind of had been a little fuzzy before, but as wars throughout, well, maybe not throughout, but as wars over the past 200 years in Europe have shown, wars will very quickly solidify a national identity and help forge it where one had perhaps not previously existed. So I strongly suspect, given current trends in Ukrainian society and whatnot, that when the war ends, Ukraine will most likely have a very strong national identity, much more so than it had at the start, which is, again, which is very ironic considering that was kind of extinguishing that. It's ironic because the extinguishing of that identity had been nominally one of the major Russian objectives at the start of the invasion. So that definitely is not going to go according to plan for them. But yeah, the formation of the state goes hand in hand with the national identity. It's kind of part and parcel with each other. Yeah, the reason anti-corruption in Ukraine has been in the news recently is because there was a big scandal as far as conscription. So, as you know, Ukraine has conscription and has been mobilizing people into the army. In other words, forcing them to fight, which is that's what conscription always and forever is. You're forcing people to fight involuntarily. Obviously, Ukraine has a good reason for doing so right now, given that they've been invaded. But even so, there's a lot of people, even people who may nominally think of themselves as patriots, who are very squeamish about the prospect of fighting on a front line. Understandably so, given how destructive and violent the conflict has been. And so there's been a trend, well, maybe not a trend, but there have been several documented cases now of people bribing recruitment officials to avoid the draft, to avoid being conscripted into the Ukrainian army. And so when that came out, it got to be a scandal in the Ukrainian army. Well, the Ukrainian government had to, one, crack down on the bad behavior, obviously. From what I was reading, there was a mass purge, basically, of recruitment officials. They effectively fired almost all of the leading recruitment officials in the Ukrainian army. So broad sweeping reform there, obviously. But two, they also had to come out and deal with newfound accusations from the West that the Ukrainian government was inherently corrupt and not worth supporting. And that's important because the political front, or perhaps the diplomatic front, if you like, of the Ukrainian conflict extends into the West and into Western political conversations. You know, Ukraine needs Western support to continue fighting. And so managing the perception of Ukraine in the West is an important part of the Ukrainian government's war effort. So when something like this happens, like a scandal, and it makes the Ukrainian government look bad, they're very proactive in doing damage control, specifically in the West and in the United States in particular. And there's definitely been an uptick in people in the West and also in the United States in particular complaining about the Ukraine war. Lots of people have been pointing out that it's expensive. They'd rather spend the money at home. You know, in the United States case, that's a little ironic since that's never going to happen. But nominally, that's the criticism. You know, the money we spend on Ukraine is money we could spend at home, so why do it? And also, they argue that Ukraine can't win, so, you know, it's a losing effort anyway. It's just a waste of money. So there's also that line of criticism. And, you know, there's also others. There's a whole variety of criticisms of Ukraine that have been popping up recently. Some of that is down to the big offensive. Ukraine launched a big offensive over the summer to try to push the Russians back, specifically in Zaporizhia, for the most part. I think they also did one around Bakhmut, but that seems to have been pretty peripheral. So there's been a lot of fighting in Zaporizhia, but not a lot of changes to the front line. You know, the Ukrainians have made some territorial gains, but it hasn't been much. And that has some people in the West disappointed, and certainly it has critics of Ukraine in the West feeling emboldened. And they've taken the opportunity to unleash a whole torrent of articles and criticism and, you know, all manner of accusations that the war is a lost cause and the West needs to end it as soon as possible, which is also not going to happen. That's a whole conversation unto itself. You know, I was actually talking about this to Moss recently. You know, basically my comment was, even if you go to the Russians and say you want to cut a deal, they're not going to accept it because their whole plan is to just wait until the West gets bored and goes away and cuts support to Ukraine. So if the West says, you know, we would really like to stop supporting Ukraine, so we would like a peace deal as soon as possible. Well, that just tells the Russians that you're getting tired and that you're getting close to breaking, which is what they want. And so the takeaway there is not to sign a peace deal. The takeaway there is to keep fighting because you're almost at the point where the West is going to cut and run, and then you can win. And at that point, it doesn't matter how badly the first part of the war went for the Russians. If they can win in the end, it's all justified, at least in their minds anyway. So going to the Russians and saying you want to cut a peace deal because you're getting tired of how expensive the war is not going to have the result you think it will. It's not going to result in a peace deal. You're just telling the Russians they're winning at that point, and then the war is just going to keep dragging on.
Yeah. Don't let them see that you're tired. That's what my football coaches in Texas said. Even if you're very tired, because they are also tired.
Yeah, that's quite relevant here. It's a similar dynamic. So some of the criticism in that vein is wrong-footed, in my opinion. Some of the other criticisms are relatively more valid, you know, in so much as there is corruption in Ukraine, and in so much as the fighting doesn't really seem to have a logical endpoint at this juncture. But at least as far as, you know, pushing for a peace deal, that's not the best or strongest criticism. That's probably the weakest one that I've seen thus far. But anyway, that's why people have been talking about corruption in Ukraine. It had to do with the draft bribery scandal. You know, people
Gotcha.
bribing the draft recruiters, and the Ukrainian government has responded robustly. You know, again, firing a huge number of recruiters in order to completely shake up and reform the institution in question.
Yeah, as a note, we talked about this when the war first started, as part of Zelensky's backstory, because they're trying to figure out like who this guy is and why he has so much popular support in Ukraine. He was an actor, and one of the TV shows that he was on was actually about the corruption in the Ukrainian government. So it's really funny that he would go from acting that out and doing all that like social and cultural commentary about how Ukraine is doing, and they're like, you know what? You did great in this TV show. Being the actual president, it's not that different. Do you want to just do that? And he said yes, and he ran. So
You forgot to mention the best part. What role did he play on the TV show?
wasn't he the president?
He was the president. Yeah,
Yeah.
he played the president on a popular comedy on Ukrainian
Yeah,
television.
that's practice. He practiced.
That's how he got famous. That's how
Yeah.
his name got known. Worked out pretty well for him. And he's, for a guy who was a former actor on a comedy, he's done pretty well, you have to admit. He's definitely surpassed expectations in the war.
Yep.
Although, to be fair, it's worth mentioning, too, that before the war started, he was not very popular.
Hmm.
He won the presidency on a wave of support, but that started to flounder pretty quickly. So by the time you got to February 2022, his approval rating was subpar. It was not looking great for him. People were disappointed about lack of progress on the Donbass issue, lack of progress on the economy, lack of progress on anti-corruption. There just seemed to be a lot of things that he had underdelivered on over the course of his presidency. But then the war started, and he kind of outdid himself. He ended up being a very charismatic, strong leader,
Yeah,
which is
he did a
exactly
lot
what
of
they needed.
the badassery that people wish that their leaders did, which is like, Zelensky, we can help evacuate you out of Ukraine. Do you want an evac? He said, I don't need a ride, I need ammo. Everyone's like, holy shit. Yeah, those kind of moments where you're put into an extremely dire circumstance and you wouldn't have known how the leader would respond, because a lot of people do flee, and that's a valid move. You can flee the combat and go to a safer location, that kind of thing.
Well, to be fair to the lesser politicians of the world, most of them do not have the opportunity to be badasses. It's one thing to be a badass during a war, but if you're trying to do, I don't know, healthcare reform, like there's not really an equivalent to that line. A country at peace does not proffer a lot of opportunities to look sexy in front of a camera. Whatever you can say about war, it definitely does provide such opportunities. So you credit Zelensky for taking the opportunity. Certainly not everybody would be able to, or would even want to, in that position. But most politicians would not have a similar opportunity. Again, during peacetime, there's only so much you can do. You can only appear so badass advocating for, marginal incremental reform.
Yeah. He got a large occasion to rise to.
Exactly. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That was a fun propaganda move at the beginning because he didn't run away. Yeah, just out of curiosity, would you say that you have a favorable view of him? Because I'm guessing that you are Ukrainian so far. Because we, as Westerners, we see, I would say, a lot more pro Zelensky stuff in the media because he is kind of seen as a hero, just from our perspective of being a freedom fighter, blah, blah, blah. And also being an opponent of Russia, which is kind of like the next iteration of our historical Cold War villain, the Soviet Union.
Yeah, kind of a legacy villain.
Yeah.
The villain everybody loves to hate.
Yeah. Well, you can see it like even just in our normal superhero movies and stuff. Like there's the US and they're trying to do stuff and organize all the heroes, but then the Russians are also doing stuff and they're the bad guys and they wear black and red and all this kind of stuff. So you need some kind of villain, and because the Cold War was the last like I would say, great military rivalry that we had, then that's a lot of what our art represents as well.
Yeah. Yeah, Hollywood really struggled after the Cold War to find compelling international villains.
Mm,
They basically had to resort to terrorists,
yeah.
just sort of bland, generic terrorists. And those are pretty evil, right? But nobody likes terrorists,
Hmm.
unless you're a terrorist anyway. But
Then you love being a terrorist because that's your job.
yeah. But beyond that, they just didn't have any like particular country or government or group that they could kind of point to and say, "Oh yeah, that's the consensus evil opponent."
Yeah.
So they ended up defaulting very frequently to some traditional notions of Russians as the inherent bad guys,
Hmm.
which required no small amount of contortions on their part, because obviously the Russian government wasn't really in a position to threaten too many people, globally. So they had to create these weird scenarios where it was like a rogue officer, a rogue general, or a military government, or maybe some international corrupt mafia organization. Just there was always weird stuff like that they had to do.
Hmm.
Or they could just completely detach from reality and have Russia invade America. I think that was a popular video game for a while.
Yeah.
What was it, like
Well,
one of the Call of Duty games or something?
yeah. Another classic one that they do in media is like moon Nazis, or somehow the Nazis still survived and they're somewhere. Because that was a very, like, someone asked me recently, what are the most evil empires of all time that have existed? And that's obviously a very fresh one that comes to mind. But
Yeah.
some of the other ones, like you have lots of evil dictators that have passed through, and Stalinist Russia, I think, or Stalinist Soviet Union was another very hyper aggressive one.
Yeah, yeah, definitely popular villains for their eras.
Yeah.
But Russians kind of got a bad rap after the Cold War. They kind of improved significantly in terms of human rights.
Yeah, well, similar to how Americans get stereotyped, because we get to see a lot of that by having a lovely international audience on Twitch, is the United States government has done its fair share of fuckery around the world as well.
Oh
And
yeah,
any American Twitch viewer you see, there's a very low chance they were personally involved in any of that behavior, but that shadow is cast upon the people as well, and that's tough. Like, you get stereotyped or whatever. So for Russian citizens as well, they're kind of being stereotyped as Putin's people, and what he does kind of reflects how the world sees them. So that's one of the things that I would say a lot of national leaders don't really care too much about, especially if they're a dictator or an autocrat or something, is they don't really care how their people are going to be perceived by their decisions. They just want to have power, and whatever gives them power in their country, they're very happy with. So yeah, if we ever overly stereotype people of a certain nation, just let us know. We're here to try to get the best perspective of the world we can, and we're limited in that both of us speak English as our primary language, so a lot of the news media that we get isn't going to be sharing all sides of it, especially if it's in a language that's not one we can read.
yeah. I think people were starting to kind of converge on China as a consensus villain,
Yeah,
specifically the Communist Party of China. And so Russia's image kind of was improving in that regard. And then they invaded Ukraine. So,
yeah, and then they went back to the villain.
yeah.
Did you watch the new
Yeah.
Top Gun yet?
Actually, no, I still haven't seen it. It's on my list, but no, I haven't seen it.
I would say, chat, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think it's a spoiler. Well, I'm going to tell you anyway. The villain in it is not stated as being Russia, but they are in Eastern Europe, and they're doing stuff with potential weaponry. So it's kind of like you can fill in the blank yourself as a viewer. But I think the Soviet Union or whatever was the antagonist of the first Top Gun movie. And one of the fun facts with the new Top Gun was I think they got less of a deal in China, or they don't even get seen in China, because he had a Taiwan patch on his fighter pilot jacket. So that was a thing. That's one of the downsides of using China as a villain in media, is they won't show your media.
Yeah. Actually, they made their own version of it, didn't they?
The wrong version of what?
Well, China made their own version of Top Gun.
Oh, did they?
Yeah. That's very common. Popular movies in the West often get Chinese adaptations. I don't think they did it legally per se. I don't think they asked for permission. But it was very obviously modeled on the new Top Gun movie, from what I've read.
Oh. Chat's also saying that the first Top Gun was the same and that they didn't name their opponent. Thank you. I did not remember that.
Yeah, I thought I remembered that, but it's been so long, the memory is kind of fuzzy. Yeah, I don't think they were ever like super clear on who the opponent was. The enemy aircraft were supposed to be Russian, although they weren't actually, but they were supposed to be. They tried to make them look Russian. That was a normal move back in the day.
Yeah.
Back in the day, they didn't really have a lot of actual Soviet aircraft around for movies and stuff. So what they would do is they would get like a F-5 or one of the other lesser known Western aircraft, and they would paint a big red star on it and maybe add like some canards or something, and then they would try to pretend that it was like a Soviet airplane. It was always entertaining to me as an aircraft guy when I was a kid. I would be watching these movies where the bad guys are supposed to be flying like MiGs or Sukhois, and I'm like, oh, that's an F-5.
Mm-hmm.
That's very obviously an F-5. You're not fooling me, movie. I'm not sure where we were coming from, but I think we pretty well covered it. You were mentioning anti-corruption in Ukraine. We talked about that.
Yeah.
And then we had some tangents, but I think we covered the original point, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yeah, and you'll have some stuff to read in chat from our Ukrainian viewer about their perspective on Zelensky and stuff.
Oh, cool. I look forward to it.
Yeah.
Always love getting feedback from people.
Yep, first-hand accounts are awesome. So I think we covered all the talking points. Prigozhin, Republican primary debate, Taliban decided women can't go to parks. Islamic State in Mali we covered. Yeah, and Zelensky corruption measures. So yeah, is there anything else that's been interesting in the
Lots.
news of the world?
There's plenty going on.
We've got about 50 minutes, so fire away, Captain.
Yeah, we'll be able to fill the 50 very easily. I just want to try to find a good place to start here. Oh, yeah, I guess I shout out to Dagnip. I've been working on my email response to him. Dagnip is a pretty prolific writer. He adds a lot of detail to his email, so I try to return the courtesy by doing my own research when I'm doing my answers. Unfortunately, it extends the response time considerably as a result, but I am working on it. So hopefully that will be up to par when I do finally send it. But yeah, Argentina has been in the news, so I thought I'd mention that. Argentina just had a primary election. I didn't know they had primaries, and they're very weird in Argentina.
How so?
Well, in the United States, primaries are party specific. You go to a given party's primary, and then you vote for your preferred candidate for whatever office it is that they're running the primary for. In Argentina, primaries are totally open to anybody from any party, which I don't know. I would ask Dagnip here, or anybody from Argentina, or anybody who knows the answer to this question. Why does Argentina run primaries like that? Because it seems like you're just running like a preliminary election at that point. Here in the U.S., primaries are meant to select a candidate for a nomination, but I don't get the impression that's what's happening in Argentina. So what exactly is the point? Is it just PR? Like, if it's just to get people's names out in the news and get people talking about the election, that makes sense. I can see that. But I guess I'm just not sufficiently familiar with Argentina's political institutions, so I would very much appreciate somebody sharing information on that. But I do know at least the outcome of the primary election, which is that the runaway standout, well, maybe not the runaway leader, but the surprise winner was a libertarian candidate. of all things. Argentina is not really known for being especially libertarian, so that definitely surprised me when I saw it. But yeah, the guy that was running on a libertarian platform of shrinking government, spending less, fighting corruption, dollarizing the economy, which basically is kind of redundant at this point since they've effectively already done it. But this guy wants to make it official. He actually wants to get rid of the central bank. So, he's not short of big policy proposals. So, yeah, he's very libertarian. And apparently he's surprisingly popular. So, I don't know if that's necessarily going to translate into general election success. I don't know the history of the correlation between primary winners in Argentina and election performance. That's something else I would have to ask somebody from Argentina. But I would infer at least that he's going to be competitive. So, of all the weird things to happen in the 2020s, the Latin American equivalent is going to be possibly a libertarian president of Argentina.
Hmm.
So something to keep your eye on.
Dagnip says he's a madman.
Yeah, that's usually what people say about libertarians, so not surprised that's what his opinion is. I think his name is Millet. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It looks like Millet to me, but it might be pronounced differently. Oh, Thailand has been in the news as well. I mentioned a little bit about this. This had a surprise ending. That's a recent development. There was a surprise ending to this drama. So, how much do you remember? We talked a little bit about it last time.
Not much.
Not much. Okay, all right. So that'll be the starting off point. So in Thailand, maybe you remember the red shirt, yellow shirt protests way back in like 2006, 8-ish.
Yep, that was one of our first world discussion things we talked about, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So way back in the day. So that resulted eventually, long story short, the result of those protests was a military coup. And the military took power and said that they were going to hold elections within a year. And then a year later, they said, actually, we need another year, so we're going to delay again. And then another year passed, and they said, actually, we're going to delay another year. And basically, they just kind of kept doing that and stringing people along until eventually people started getting pissy, and they said, okay, for real this time, we'll have an election. And that took about 8 years. They really extended the timeline there. And in the intervening years, they passed a new constitution in which the military would have the right and privilege of assigning officers 2 seats in the upper house of the country's legislature, thereby de facto, not de facto, de jure, guaranteeing the military as an institution a veto over any significant reform efforts in the Thai government. It's basically mathematically impossible for a government to pass a major constitutional reform without the permission of the military, given the military's presence in the upper house of the legislature. So not particularly democratic, and definitely not really within the purview of what you would think would be normal for a military. But of course, the military in Thailand has a long history of interfering in political affairs, so maybe not that surprising in the grand scheme of things. Regardless, new election was finally held last year. The result, unsurprisingly, is that the military candidates underperformed. A lot of people were very upset with the military and the lack of progress on restoring democratic governance and also on the economy. And also, the general who launched the coup was still trying to stay in power and running as a candidate, and he was very unpopular for a variety of reasons, among them the ones already stated, but also he was not really seen as having handled COVID particularly well, as I recall. So people were pretty sick of his shit, basically. Also, there was infighting within his party. One of his more popular lieutenants kind of undermined him. So just different thing. He did not seem to be a strong candidate by the time the election was finally held. And so he's not going to be prime minister for sure. He may not even be the leader of his own coalition at this point. Again, there's been a lot of infighting. The parties that did win were, the 2 main ones were a reform party called Move Forward, and then an older opposition party called Pheu Thai. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I apologize if not. So Pheu Thai is basically the successor party to the Red Shirts, from back in the day. The red shirts were, I forget, they've had, their political party has had different names, but they've always had, kind of the red and red shirts as their symbol, and they've always been led effectively by Thaksin Shinawatra. So Thaksin Shinawatra is a billionaire telecom magnate in Thailand. And he was the guy that basically ran as a populist, 20 some years ago and won election promising, greater subsidies, greater public services to the poor, just, kind of a grab bag of sort of left oriented policies that the Thai government had traditionally avoided doing because it had traditionally leaned pretty conservative, generally at the expense of a more left leaning electorate that was more or less dispossessed. Again, military governments have not been unusual in Thailand's history. They kind of rank up there with Turkey and Egypt as far as military governance. So, over the course of the country's history, over the past 100 years, there have been very few governments that have been interested in expanding public services. Mostly, emphasis has been on investing in the military and then corruption. Those basically have been the two main political activities by elites. So Thaksin Shinawatra took advantage of the fact that there was a great deal of unmet political demand for left-oriented policies to provide greater services to people, and he won on that campaign platform. And that got him into trouble because, of course, the military tends to be more aligned with conservative elites in the country, and they did not appreciate government resources being reoriented away from them and away from traditional elites. So that led to the red shirt, yellow shirt protests. Military intervenes. Overall, it was pretty. I'm giving you like the Cliff Notes version here. There was a period where after Thaksin was thrown out. Thaksin was thrown out originally in 2006, and then democracy was restored in short order. And then his sister came in because he was exiled. There was a warrant out for his arrest, so he left the country. But then his sister ran his party in his place, and she actually won an election held shortly thereafter the 2006 coup. And that lasted for like a year or two before there were allegations of corrupt rice subsidy schemes. And so then her government was overthrown, and that was the one that led to the 8-year interregnum in which the new constitution was passed. Kind of all over the place here, but I'm trying to give you like some framing here for current events. So the new election happens. Pheu Thai is the newest incarnation of Thaksin Shinawatra's party. And this one is being run by, I think, like a nephew or something of his. They tend to keep it in the family, basically, as far as running the party. So Pheu Thai did pretty well, but Move Forward did very well. They way exceeded expectations. They actually outperformed Pheu Thai. And so there was an expectation then that Move Forward would ally with Pheu Thai to create an opposition coalition that would dispossess the military of control of the government. Again, given the government's de facto veto in the upper house, there's kind of a natural limit on how much a coalition like that would have been able to change. But still, it would have at least gotten the military technically out of power and restored civilian governance to Thailand. So that's what people were looking forward to. And then shenanigans, right? So it was expected that, what was his name? I've got it right here. Limja Roenrat. It's kind of a mouthful. He was the guy that was expected to be prime minister. He was the lead candidate for the Move Forward party. His full name is Pita Limja Roenrat. So he was the guy that was expecting to become prime minister. But what happened is, at the last minute, the government came out and said that there were campaign finance violations. I think there was also a couple of corruption allegations in addition to that, but campaign finance allegations of illegal campaign finance were the main ones. So that technically, supposedly disqualified Limja Roenrat from office. And so that put a stop to the pending coalition that was being negotiated. So after that, there was a question of just what kind of coalition could then emerge. Obviously, Move Forward could put forward a different candidate, but it seemed like the government was going out of its way to stop that. So there was an open question as to what would happen going forward. And so that brings us to the twist ending that happened just recently, which is that the lead military parties are going to be in government by forming a coalition with Pheu Thai. which again is led by Thaksin Shinawatra, the populist leader that the military had removed from power, either personally or in the form of his party, on 3 separate occasions.
Wow.
They're natural rivals. They are not friends. Like, over the past 20 years, Thaksin Shinawatra and the Thai military have been just mortal enemies. And now they're going to be in a coalition government together.
Interesting.
Yeah, very unexpected. And of course, the loser here is Move Forward, which is the Reform Party that had, strong support from the youth and was pushing really hard for big pro-democracy, pro-liberalization reforms that would have very much changed the status quo. But it was the fact that they were so popular and that they wanted such dramatic changes that has resulted in this coalition. The military, for its part, obviously did not want to give up power at all, but they didn't feel like they could hang on to power just, by ignoring the election. That wasn't viable. So this is a compromise for them. They're going to give up some power and allow for some changes, but by and large, the conservative status quo will largely be unchallenged, it seems. Move Forward's agenda is definitely not going to be implemented. Mm-hmm. So, there is some progress here. It's not like a complete defeat for the reform movement, but it is disappointing. They're not going to get nearly as dramatic a set of change as they thought that they were likely to get, given the election results. There's also a lot of butthurt about the Pho Thai. The reform movement writ large had expected Pho Thai to be a natural ally, and instead it has effectively stabbed them in the back. So there's a lot of upset about that in particular. Pho Thai will probably reap some penalty for that, especially if their new government does not perform well. It's worth pointing out that politics in Thailand are not completely ideological. There is a lot of kind of quid pro quo patronage network type stuff that happens. And, like I said a long time ago when we were talking about this election, Pho Thai kind of has an innate advantage in that they have an established political machine. They're very good at delivering goods, resources, patronage, basically, to the people who vote for them and to the people who manage the party. So they have that as a big advantage over Move Forward. Move Forward is a new party. It's basically led by, technocrats and idealists. So, while that definitely gave the party a lot of energy and popularity and media presence, the fact that they didn't have a strong ground game worked against them. So Pho Thai, as populist as it is, has always been run by cynical realists, you might say. They're not people in it for the ideals. They're people in it for the money. Mm-hmm. And because they were able to deliver that for a long time, they've been able to get a lot of support. They will probably continue to be able to deliver it, given that that's likely to be a prerequisite to the coalition deal that was made with the established military parties. So that's not going to change. What is going to change is that Pho Thai is going to lose its populist credentials. They may be able to deliver the goods and get past money from the government to constituents, but they're not going to be able to realistically claim to be a reformist party at this point. Being in a coalition government with pro-military parties that are themselves directly controlled by the military, you cannot claim to be reformists and do something like that. Mm-hmm. And certainly not when they had an option to form a coalition government with the other main opposition party, Move Forward. If the only way to get any kind of new coalition government with any kind of reform platform in power was to do a coalition with the military, people would have been okay with it. It would have been understandable. But it was perfectly viable for them to form a coalition with Move Forward, and they just elected not to do it. They had a choice of having an opposition government, and they said, no, I'd rather cut a deal with the military. So that's kind of skeevy backroom politics type stuff. And we've already seen, kind of what the terms of that agreement are. Because Thaksin Shinawatra has basically been in exile from Thailand for 20-some years now, a long time. But guess who just came back to Thailand?
Him. Yeah.
Yeah, all of a sudden, after this deal was made, Thaksin Shinawatra is back in Thailand. Now, he did turn himself in, he did appear before a judge, and he was given an 8-year sentence that has to do with all of the election shenanigans that he was accused of way back in the day. And he is technically in prison right now, but he has been assessed by the prison to be of frail health. And for now, he's still detained, but it's not clear if he's actually going to serve any time. And I would imagine part of the terms of the deal that were made between Pho Thai and the military parties is that he's not going to serve time. Probably he's going to have the sentence commuted sometime in the next couple weeks, I would guess. So it seems like Thaksin Shinawatra traded away the possibility of a reformist opposition government in exchange for basically having the charges against him dropped so he can come back to Thailand and actually be in the country again. So that's great for Thaksin Shinawatra, but maybe not so great for the health and modernization and liberalization of Thai politics. Again, lots of people very disappointed in this outcome.
Yeah, sounds a little bit like a deal with the devil.
Well, to be fair, if Move Forward had entered a coalition with Shinawatra and the Pho Thai, that also would have been a deal with the devil. Because again, that's a political machine. They're not idealists. They're about delivering the goods. So while they're significantly more in touch with the people than, say, the military, which doesn't even really bother that much with the people, unless it comes to raising taxes for the military, in which case they're very interested. But beyond that, yeah, Pho Thai and Shinawatra are much more in touch with the public. But they're not ideal. Move Forward is, so they're going to lose that going forward. That represents a significant change in the political landscape of Thailand. Shinawatra is basically incorporating himself into the established elite. And, to be fair, the established elite are also making room for him, which is not something that they were doing before. They were very much dead set against doing that. So now relations between all of the major elites, be they left or right wing, will be normalized. And most likely the result would be something resembling stable politics. All of the upstarts, the reformists, the idealists to Move Forward that wanted to change things, they have basically been excluded from power. And it's not likely that they're going to have a good window back in until the next election, which may or may not see them get as much support as they got this time. Again, it's going to come down to how well the new coalition government performs. If they do well, they could well undermine support for Move Forward. And it may be that any significant reformist campaign platform is not going to be your winning platform for a long time in that case. Now, if the coalition government underperforms, Move Forward will have a very strong case to make, and they'll probably get a lot of support. Pho Thai could be rendered irrelevant in doing so, depending on how bad things get. But that's all in the future, though. That's speculation on my part. Now, while disappointment is understandable, again, the conservatives, the military parties basically have given some concessions that will please them to a degree. So part of the price that was paid here is that the military parties have agreed to make efforts to boost the economy. Specifically, they're going to support Pho Thai's platform by which they want to boost the economy, which invariably is going to involve government spending, industrial policy, what have you. So they're going to do that. They've agreed to increase the minimum wage. They've agreed to end mandatory conscription. They've also agreed to continue the legalization of medical marijuana. And they're going to work to amend the Constitution to make the country, quote unquote, more democratic. Color me skeptical on that last one, but we'll see. Hope springs eternal. But, that's a relatively liberal platform overall. So, that's not as much as the Move Forward folks would have liked, but it is progress. So, the gears of justice move slowly, but they do move. And in so much as the military has allowed, some democratic governance, it is delivering some goods here. So it's not a complete disaster. It is just disappointing. So keep in mind that framing. Keep in mind that context, rather.
Change almost always happens slower than we might prefer.
Yeah, unfortunately so. But it is at least happening at this point in Thailand. So there is reason for some optimism. I think I'm going to delay outbound investment again. That's an interesting topic for me, but it's probably pretty boring for the listeners, and I'm sure there's other stuff that I think are more pressing. So let's try to squeeze in the Ukraine update before we delay it any further. I think the last time we did it was June 25th, July 25th.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's been a while. Yeah. So I won't get too bogged down in the details since we're kind of running short on time, but I'll try to hit the highlights here. I had been accumulating a Prigozhin update, a Prigozhin summary of all of the Wagner-related stuff that has happened since the mutiny. Um, Kind of feels a little irrelevant now since Prigozhin is dead, but there has been other stuff not related to Prigozhin that's worth mentioning. For one, following the mutiny, there was a big crackdown. Well, maybe not a big crackdown, but there was a crackdown within the Russian army. So there was a guy named Surovikin, who was actually the guy who had been leader of the Russian expedition into Syria, and who had been appointed general chief of staff for the overall Russian war effort in Ukraine. And he was removed from his position after the mutiny. It was not clear if the removal was permanent. It was kind of a detained situation. They were detaining him to question him, basically, to see what his culpability in the mutiny was. He was perceived to be relatively close to Prigozhin and to have perhaps been a co-conspirator. We'll probably never know the full extent of that, but the government was suspicious enough that they went after him. And more recently, I think last month or so, no, in August, actually, in August, it was made official that he was officially removed from his position as head of the Air Force. So he has been officially reassigned at this point. So Surovikin is definitely one of the casualties here. He was kind of a brutal guy. He was known for being a butcher in Syria, and he employed similar tactics in his management of the war effort in Ukraine. But at the same time, he was also probably one of the more experienced, capable generals in the Russian military. So the fact that he's been removed is both good and bad from the Ukrainian perspective. It's good in so much as they have somebody, in so much as they've removed somebody who is taking a brutal approach as far as bombing civilian targets and whatnot. But it's also kind of a good thing in so much as Russia has basically removed one of their more capable guys from the chessboard. Mm-hmm. So if the guy that replaces if the guy who replaces Surovikin is less capable, that'll be to the advantage of the Ukrainians. So some optimism there, at least. Let's see. The Russian government also went after Surovikin's deputy and the deputy head of military intelligence, although they were later released, albeit suspended from the military. The Russian government also went after a former deputy defense minister who had spearheaded, I'll just read the quote here, who spearheaded the deadly siege of the Ukrainian city of Mariupol and later joined Wagner. So he was also detained, one of the more high-level guys, or at least one of the former high-level guys. Once you reach a certain threshold in the politics of an authoritarian country, you generally develop the connections necessary to retain substantive influence, even after you leave an official position. So being a former Russian deputy defense minister may not sound that important, but he probably has pretty good connections, which no doubt he's using now. If you get detained, you're going to be making some phone calls. So he'll probably avoid getting in too much trouble. But the fact that somebody like him could be arrested in the first place illustrates how seriously the government was taking it. Let's see, I already talked about Wagner Group earlier. Basically, they're going to fold Wagner Group in Europe into the Russian army, or at least the parts of Wagner Group that weren't sent to Belarus. The parts of Wagner Group working in Africa are probably going to be allowed to continue on as before, albeit perhaps under different management. But otherwise, the Wagner Group units operating there will continue to be independent. Let's see, we already talked about Prigozhin. Supposed to stay in Belarus, did not stay in Belarus, did not end well for him in the long run. That's the long and short of that. Let's see. Stuff that's basically old hat now. Immediately after the coup, Putin actually met with Prigozhin. Prigozhin was there with 35 separate Wagner commanders in that same meeting, and they all basically talked together about the war effort. Surprisingly chummy, basically, given that the commanders in question, including Prigozhin, had just been the head of a mutiny. But maybe that was part of the quid pro quo there. There was some Western intelligence officials saying Prigozhin had been planning to seize top defense officials in Moscow, but that the FSB had discovered the plot and forced Prigozhin to act early, which is perhaps why things did not go entirely according to plan. Worth mentioning, too, that Western intelligence officials have done a lot of what you might call pot stirring. There's a phrase in English called stirring the pot. It refers to somebody who goes out of their way to aggravate relations between other people.
For their own benefit or for entertainment, usually.
Yeah. So Western intelligence officials are perhaps providing context to the Western public about events in Russia, but I suspect they're also going out of their way to exacerbate tensions between elites in Russia by releasing information that may or may not be true, probably not true, but which could undermine trust between those elites. So whenever I see a release from an intelligence official like that, I'm a little bit skeptical. I'm immediately skeptical about whether or not they're just trying to basically do the intelligence equivalent of shitposting. Let's see. Oh, I read an article arguing with, relatively convincingly that the institutional response in Russia to the Wagner mutiny was pretty weak. So for one, Rosgvardia, the National Guard unit that was designed and created for internal security, actually went out of its way to avoid direct confrontation with Wagner Group during the mutiny, which is pretty much exactly the opposite of what you want an internal security organization doing in an event like that. So not very impressive there. The FSB, for its part, didn't really seem to do anything at all. In so much as they were relevant, they basically just barricaded themselves in their offices in Rostov and tried to ignore the mutiny. Again, not terribly impressive. The GRU, for its part, saw its first deputy head, a guy named Vladimir Alexeyev, actually meet with Prigozhin in Rostov at the beginning of the mutiny. And they basically just hung out and talked. And Alexeyev even apparently said during the meeting that he agreed with Prigozhin that the leadership of the war had been very poor. So all in all, some of these major security institutions in Russia that you would think would be responsible for containing a mutiny like this basically did fuck all, which kind of brings into question their veracity here. That said, I don't think we should conclude that Russia's internal security is hollow. I would refer to the comments at the beginning of today's segment regarding how politics within patronage networks and authoritarian governments tends to be pretty combative. So, and on the one hand, they tend to be combative, but they also tend to be kind of clubby. It's almost like a big club where people compete for positions and power and whatnot. And so, on the one hand, yes, these institutions like the GRU, the FSB, Rosgvardia, they did underperform, but that may perhaps be indicative of relationships between elites rather than weakness on their part. Basically, the leadership of those institutions may have decided that they would rather not directly confront Prigozhin, just because it would have been more trouble than it was worth politically for their own position in the extended patronage network they're in, as opposed to avoiding him because they thought they would lose or because they didn't want to get hurt or something like that. It was more of a political decision than a military decision, in other words. Still, the fact that that's the way it panned out kind of illustrates the almost medieval court-like nature of an authoritarian political system like what Russia has at this point. So when the chips are down, all of the nobility that comprise, an extended patronage like that, network like that, they're going to be very mercenary. In a crisis, if the leader is strong and they think the leader will maintain power, the nobility will rally and defend him. Mm-hmm. But if that's not the case, if the leader looks weak or if it looks like he's going to lose power, all of the nobles are going to abandon him and they're going to start fighting with each other to see who takes power next. So centralized political systems like what Russia has, the authoritarian system, monarchy, you can almost call it, they're very stable right up until they're not. That's sort of the smart-ass academic description of that. Basically, if you have a strong leader who's good at management, monarchy, or centralized authoritarian government, it can look strong as long as they're in power. But if they start screwing up or they're replaced by somebody less competent, then the whole thing just changes overnight.
Yeah, the stability is a very top-heavy thing.
Yeah.
Kind of like I guess, who's it? Genghis Khan? He did that kind of thing where he had a lot of power consolidated around him, but it wasn't as though there was a Mongolian empire that ruled the world after that because he wasn't really an administrator. That wasn't his strength. His strength was rallying people together and then wrecking shit and then taking territory. So yeah, it kind of makes sense that any very authoritarian system relies very heavily upon the person, or in the case of, say, North Korea, a family dynasty that keeps control of it. and they
Yeah.
maintain a lot of similarities between the generations.
Yeah, so long as you send them to a private international school in Switzerland, you can probably get at least passable leadership out of your children. But there's no guarantee. Did you know about that? Did you know that the
Yeah.
current leader, Kim Jong Un, yeah, he went to school in Switzerland when he was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
That's where he got his education. Apparently, he did have a government minder with him while he was there, but the fact that they sent him to Switzerland at all just blows my mind.
I'm kind of surprised that they agreed to teach him, but I guess what are they going to do? Say, no, we don't like what your country is doing, so we won't teach your child? They may have had the hope in the back of their mind that they could shift him in some way that would cause him to not be a dictator, but I don't know.
Well, it is a private school. You know, as long as you pay up, they're probably willing to look the other way.
You give us money, we teach you things.
There you go. Yeah, elite private schools like that are not uncommon in Europe. You know, it's well, let me rephrase that. It's very common for elites all over the world to send their children to elite private schools like that. So, you know, it's definitely unusual to me that, you know, the North Korean dynasty would send their children to Switzerland for education. But there are plenty of other unsavory governments that no doubt send their progeny to places like that school.
Mm-hmm.
North Korea is easily one of, if not the most egregious human rights abusers on the planet as far as governments go. But there's plenty of other human rights abusers that send their children, you know, abroad. So that is not actually that unusual.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not surprised the private school. In other words, I'm not surprised the private school took him. I'm just shocked that the North Korean government would trust one of their children to go abroad.
Yeah.
That was the more surprising thing for me.
Well, in a sense, that shows that there is some awareness within the elite in North Korea where they know, different from their propaganda, that other countries do have it a lot better in almost every way possible, including education. So for them to acknowledge that and be like, hey, we're kind of crippled by our own necrocracy where we worship the dead and have an eternal ruler. Maybe we should send our kids somewhere else to learn stuff and they can do it better and come back and be a leader. That's one of the things that I saw in the North Korea documentary, the old Vice one, where they basically depict their country as like one of the last bastions of good living, and the rest of the world is beholden to the wickedness of America, which many other countries agree to some of that sentiment, and I think that's part of what allows it to stick as well as it does. But they are leaking Korean soap operas over the border, so they are seeing a little bit of what the world looks like on the other side.
Yeah, they've been cracking down on that, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the North Korean government has gotten more authoritarian over the past couple years, if you can believe that.
I thought they already maxed out that stat.
Well, the trouble is that the economy was really struggling, and so they kind of had to allow a private sector to develop, sort of informally.
Oh.
You know, the government kind of looked the other way in order to kind of generate more tax revenue. And the result is that there were more things like, you know, South Korean K-dramas and other stuff like that that were penetrating North Korean society. But after COVID hit, there was a big famine. I think there's technically an ongoing famine in North Korea. And the economy just took a bad hit. And the government, I think, has gotten sufficiently concerned about its hold on power that it has decided to crack down on what limited space it had opened up for independent entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. And the result is that people are now being punished severely again. I mean, it was always illegal to hold contraband like that in North Korea, and they would still punish people for it, you know, especially if you got caught with it. But in general, the government wasn't looking too hard either. You know, they weren't really trying actively to try to catch you. They are now. Now it's seen as more of a problem. Yeah, just a very rough place to live in general, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Had you heard the story about the guy that was originally intended to succeed Kim Jong-il?
No.
Kim Jong-un was actually his younger son. His older son was originally intended to inherit the leadership of North Korea. But his son ended up disgracing himself, and so ended up basically voiding his claim to the throne.
How did he do that again?
He went to Disney World.
Oh, yeah, that's very fucked up. You can't do that.
He went to Disney World in Japan, and people found out about it.
Oh
It
man,
made the
openly
rounds.
going to Disney World in Japan?
Yeah, dude
Really
got
off the
caught.
rails at that point.
Oh, yeah, can't have it. So at that point, he was disqualified, and he ended up leaving North Korea and basically living in exile. So Kim Jong Un kind of defaulted into the leadership role as a result.
That's so silly.
Yeah, so it gets worse too because Kim Jong Un did not trust him to stay out of North Korean politics, and so he actually had him assassinated.
Oh, I thought you were about to say keep him out of Disney World.
Well, not mutually exclusive. I mean, he's definitely not going to Disney World
He
again.
had his brother assassinated?
Yep.
Jeez Louise.
Did it in a weird way too. Well, maybe not necessarily a weird way. Poisoning is not that weird, but the approach was unusual. So what they did is they sent a team of assassins to Malaysia because they knew he had a flight there. And so the idea was that they would catch him while he was changing flights or arriving or whatever. He was in the airport. And what happened is that they got some, allegedly, again, this is allegedly, we may never know the full truth, but what the people responsible, what the people arrested said is that they were approached by some people who said they wanted to do a prank on somebody. And so they said, yeah, sure, I'll do a prank. And so the prank just happened to involve them inadvertently exposing the target, in this case, uh, the son of Kim Jong il, the eldest son of Kim Jong il, to a nerve agent, which was sufficient to kill him, like, very quickly.
That's a very mean prank.
Yeah, you could say that again. So supposedly the people involved were not aware that they were inadvertently involving themselves in an assassination. Again, supposedly it was supposed to be something recorded for like a TV show or something.
Damn.
Anyway, that's a tangent.
It's an entertaining tangent. I didn't know someone could be so butt mad about someone going to Disney World, but here we are.
Well, to be fair, I don't think it was about Disney World for Kim Jong Un. I think he just wanted to clean up loose ends, tie up loose ends, make sure that his brother never tried to make a comeback of any kind. It's an authoritarian political system, right? It's all Game of Thrones type shit.
Yeah, they're not
Let's
really
hear
about
that.
virtue and compassion and supporting your fellow family member.
Yeah, yeah. You're about protecting yourself and ensuring that risks are mitigated.
Mm-hmm.
And the risks are significant because anybody who takes power has every incentive to just kill you.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, let's talk about artillery shells.
Sure.
So Ukraine obviously has a shortage of artillery shells. That's been one of the things that they've been really struggling with since the war started. The Russians at this point are also struggling with the shortage of artillery shells, but the shortage is not nearly as pressing as that which is facing the Ukrainian army. So obviously they're going to try to get them wherever they can. Western aid is a big source, but I've read that one of their major sources of artillery shells at this point is actually South Korea. South Korea, unlike Western nations, has actually tried to maintain a pretty sizable defense complex, defense industrial complex. And maybe I should rephrase that. Obviously, the United States has a massive military industrial complex. But South Korea is a little different in that they were still focused on producing sort of traditional weapons. So, the United States downsized its productive capacity as far as artillery shells and other sort of smaller, older types of munitions like that. South Korea did not. South Korea still has a lot of productive capacity. They were still very much trying to be self-sufficient in weaponry like that. And so the result is that they've been able to export significant quantities of artillery shells to Ukraine, and as a result have been a very important supporter of Ukraine's war effort by extension. Now, the interesting thing to note here is that South Korea has to play one of these dumb diplomatic games as a part of its effort to help Ukraine. This is not uncommon in diplomacy, but I'm sure this will make some of you roll your eyes. So South Korea does not openly sell weapons to Ukraine because it does not want to aggravate Russia specifically. China is also kind of part of it, but Russia is actually the more important party here. So the reason that South Korea does not want to aggravate Russia is because they're afraid that Russia will send more, well, will basically send significant amounts of military aid to North Korea. Because right now Russia has kind of a more or less normal relationship with North Korea, but they don't really send them a lot of aid or otherwise help them in their uh, confrontation. Whatever you want to call the weird status quo on the Korean Peninsula is the de facto war. Well, de jure, I should say. The de jure war between North Korea and South Korea is ongoing, and South Korea does not want Russia buddying up with North Korea any more than it already does. So in order to avoid aggravating them, it has a rule in place in which it will not sell weaponry to states at war. And well, technically that's not a rule that was implemented to appease Russia. That was a rule they already had on the books, but they've been very particular about respecting that rule in order to avoid aggravating Russia. However, South Korea nonetheless is still supplying significant quantities of artillery shells to Ukraine. So how does that work? Well, basically, they sell to Poland and other states in Europe, who then send those munitions on to Ukraine. And the thing is that the South Korean government knows that's happening. Obviously, the European governments in question know what's happening. And honestly, even Russia knows that it's happening. But everybody is just pretending that it's not. Like I said, it's one of those dumb diplomatic games that governments play with each other. On paper, the South Korean government is sending a signal that it wants decent relations with Russia and that it prefers cooperation over confrontation. But that's a symbolic effort. At the same time, it's sending a signal to the West and to Ukraine that it wants to support the West and the United States in standing up to aggression by larger states against smaller states. And selling weapons to Ukraine, de facto Ukraine, albeit circuitously, underlines that alliance and that common commitment to the so-called rules-based international order. So technically, South Korea is not supporting Ukraine, but de facto it is. Also, it's worth pointing out that another consideration here is politics, because politically speaking, the prospect of South Korea participating in the proxy war in Ukraine, which is kind of effectively what it is at this point, is unpopular. People really don't want the South Korean getting involved in the Ukrainian conflict. And so the South Korean government, in order to respect that, has taken a somewhat ambiguous approach to its involvement. Still involved, very clearly it is, but part of that is the South Korean government trying to improve relations with the United States. The South Korean government is kind of not fully dependent, but largely dependent on the United States for its security, and so it does try to send signals that it wants to cooperate on this, that, or the other global security issue. And Ukraine is obviously one of them. And also the South Korean government itself is just interested because of the precedent of big states involving small states, does not favor it. It doesn't want to propagate that kind of precedent since South Korea itself is a small state. So the South Korean government is a lot more gung-ho than the public is as far as Ukraine. But that still leaves lots of discretion for the South Korean government to involve itself indirectly, which is what's happening. So Ukraine is getting its shells, which is obviously optimal as far as the West and the South Korean government's perceived interests. But at the same time, it's actually not officially doing so, which appeases the Russians nominally and also appeases the anti-war faction of South Korea's politics. So everybody gets something that they want, nominally. So let's see, skipping ahead here. Yeah, talked about that. Flexible defense. Yeah, we could talk a little bit about the fighting in Zaporizhia, because I don't think we've really covered that in too much depth. So the Russians have adapted. One of the things I read about the Russians early, and tell me if I've covered this before. It's been so long, I don't quite remember all the details of what I talked about. But one of the things I read about the Russian army early in the war is that they were not fighting according to their doctrine. They were basically not even really prepared to fight. They were basically just told to march to Kiev in the expectation that the Ukrainian army would just melt before them. So the result was a just unmitigated disaster, obviously. But now they are fighting to their doctrine. So they're actually taking the war seriously, basically, at this point. and their performance has improved markedly, as a result. So they are capable of fighting if they are allowed to, when their leadership isn't being stupid. Also, it's worth mentioning here that part of Russia's adaptation, not just fighting to their doctrine, but also comes in the form of minefields. So they have laid very thick and large minefields on the front line in Zaporizhia. The distance between them, on average, I've read, is very low, by military standards. Normally, mines would be more spaced out, but they're so thick, presumably because they had such a surplus from the Cold War, that they've been able to basically make crossing them impossible, almost. You would need significant amounts of mine clearing equipment in order to get through a minefield that big and that thick. And the Ukrainians just don't have it. The West promised to send them some, but they just didn't get enough in large enough numbers fast enough. And so they had to launch the offensive without sufficient mine clearing equipment. And the result is that the offensive has been correspondingly slow. It's also worth mentioning, too, that the Russians have been pretty smart in that they recognize that a lot of the Western vehicles that the Ukrainians were receiving were designed to be able to survive a mine blast. So they would do some damage, but they would be able to recover the vehicle. So what the Russians started doing is that they started putting 2 mines in each individual position. So when you run over a mine, you're not just running over one, you actually end up setting off 2, with the result that the damage is great enough not only to disable the vehicle, but also to just outright destroy it, probably. So that is an innovation on the part of the Russians. I don't think that's been done before, or if it has, it hasn't been done like in a major European conflict. So again, the result between the Russians fighting much more effectively and the power of their defensive fortifications, specifically the minefields, has been enough to largely stymie Ukraine's offensive. Again, they've made some gains. It hasn't been like a lost cause per se, but it's definitely been rough going. And the Russians have had a veto that they've been exercising on that. As the old saying goes in warfare, the enemy always has a veto. I think I've talked before about some of the struggles the Ukrainians have been having in the offensive. For one, they just lack experience. A lot of the units they're using have been trained just in the past 6 months, which is a very, very short turnaround to take green recruits and then try to get them right on the battlefield. A lot of the vehicles they're using are unfamiliar. They just haven't had enough time to really train on them and fully familiarize themselves with them. From what I've read, the Ukrainians, from a leadership perspective, like in terms of officers, are still not very good at combined arms warfare. Also, they seem to be struggling with large formations. I think I read that company level warfare they're pretty good with. They do okay there. But once they get into the realm of managing units larger than companies, then they start losing cohesiveness. Units get lost in the shuffle, command gets confused. They just have trouble organizing, basically, large numbers of people. That's something the Russians have at times struggled with, but so it's not something that's exclusive to Ukraine. But right now, they're the ones on the offensive, and so they're the ones that are struggling with it relatively more. Also, it's worth mentioning, too, that Ukraine's army has basically never conducted a large-scale offensive against a fixed defensive position like this. Ukraine has only existed as an independent state for a couple decades, and in that time, they did not fight any conventional wars. The closest they came was in 2014, but that was very rough going. The Ukrainian army was not in a good condition at that point. They invested in a lot in it after 2014, but even so, they were pretty short on experience. A lot of their experience, what they had, was fighting separatists in Donbass. And that's a very different kind of fighting than the full-scale conventional warfare they're fighting against the Russian army. And certainly the separatists never had defensive fortifications like what the Russians have built in Zaporizhia. So what I'm saying here is that the offensive was always going to be rough, in the sense that they were throwing relatively inexperienced units into fairly well-prepared defensive fortifications, and doing so with leaders and officers that did not have experience doing so, did not have experience leading operations like that. In so much as this is the first such major offensive against defensive fortifications that Ukraine has done, we should have all expected them to struggle. Like, that was almost inevitable. Everybody was optimistic that they would be able to do well. Everybody was hoping they would do well, but the reality is that it was always going to be ugly. The Ukrainian army as an institution is learning the hard way right now. They're having to learn how to fight during a major conflict. It's not ideal, but it's what they have to do. And that invariably is going to mean taking a lot of casualties. You cannot learn during a war without taking a lot of casualties. It is an ugly way to learn, but it's also very effective. So on the one hand, Ukraine has definitely underperformed expectations. I think the expectations were too high, but regardless of that, the offensive hasn't made nearly as much ground as people were hoping for. So that's the downside. The upshot is that that was probably inevitable, and this is not going to be the last offensive. Unless Western support is pulled and Ukraine collapses, there's going to be future efforts like this. And in that sense, this is the learning curve, right? The early part of the learning curve here. An inevitable step towards building an institution, to building an army that is capable of fighting more effectively. So, ideally they would have taken more territory, but more importantly, they're learning how to do this. And in so much as that allows them to field units in the future that can do this much more efficiently and, more importantly, successfully, this is a worthwhile experience. And this is one of the reasons that people argue so vehemently against cutting support to Ukraine. People who argue that the fact that the offensive has not delivered significant results is indicative that the war is unwinnable are thinking in very short-term terms. They're thinking of this war as one that's going to be decided in the next year or two, and that Ukraine's counteroffensive here is evidence that Ukraine just cannot turn around the war in time to win it. Their time frame is way off. The estimates I've been reading are that the war is going to last 5 years, maybe 10 years total.
Mm.
So in that sense, this offensive is just the beginning. This is just the start. This is the start of what's probably going to be a series of operations in which the Ukrainian army is going to get their nose bloodied, but in exchange is going to learn how to fight.
Yeah,
And over
that's
time,
kind of like learning a StarCraft build. You can watch a video of a pro executing a build, and they've done this thousands and thousands of times. Say, for example, Ukraine looking at the U.S. operations for military and how they conduct offensive tactics and so on. You can hear about that and someone can yell at you about that as a drill sergeant, but for you to actually be in that situation and succeed involves a lot of experience of people like you're talking about, where they're field colonels and stuff and they've been there before and they know how it goes and that kind of thing. And Ukraine hasn't been doing as much foreign adventurism as the U.S. has either, so you wouldn't really expect them to be offense experts currently. So yeah, the first offensive is probably not going to be the best. Just like the first time you try to execute a complicated build order is not going to be your best version of that.
Yeah. It's the first part of the learning curve is never pretty.
Mm-hmm.
So, people should have adjusted their expectations accordingly. But, obviously the Ukraine government was going to try to toot its own horn and try to make itself look as strong as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So they probably, to a degree, oversold the offensive and raised expectations unreasonably high. I don't blame them for doing that, but Westerners should have been able to see through it more than they did.
Mm-hmm.
And people who did not support and do not support continued support to Ukraine obviously saw an opportunity there and have been exploiting it.
Mm-hmm.
But to kind of bring this full circle, the point here is that, if Ukraine is going to continue fighting, it needs more offensive like this. It needs more experience conducting offensive operations. And those offensive operations in which they're moving up the learning curve are not going to deliver a lot of results, most likely. Unless the Russians screw up and just collapse, most likely there will not be significant territorial changes for the foreseeable future. So, what that means is that we should not really judge Ukraine's army according to territorial gains, right? This war is going to be about the long haul. The West has to disabuse Russia of this notion that we're going to just cut off the Ukrainians and hand the country over to them on a platter. Mm-hmm. And that's a credibility problem. And the way you solve a credibility problem is just by making long-term credible commitments. And for now, that means continuing delivering aid to Ukraine and giving them an opportunity to continue to learn how to fight so they can eventually get in a position where they can win. Now, winning does not necessarily mean liberating Crimea and taking back all of the Donbass, right? We're not talking about marching to Moscow and, kicking out Putin. Winning could be ugly. Winning could mean conceding territory. I still very much doubt that they're going to get Crimea back. But the fact that the original expectation is that the Ukrainian army would collapse and that Russia would have a puppet government in Ukraine, anything less than that is going to be a win at this point. And it seems like they're going to get that. They're going to retain sovereignty, they're going to retain independence, and they will be able to retain an ability to defend themselves to some degree. Mm-hmm. So long as they can hang on, they'll win in that sense. But we have to continue to give them the ability to do that. And that's not going to be cheap, and it's going to take a long time. Mm-hmm. So it's not going to be a sexy, satisfying war from a military history perspective where you see like sweeping movements of armies, the breakings of lines and defensive fortifications and the seizure of territory. It's probably going to be largely static for prolonged periods, with maybe the occasional shift in territory at the margin with some incremental gains over time during long, drawn-out offensives.
Yeah, it's a battle of attrition.
Yeah, battle of attrition, like classic example. That's most likely where we're at. And I know a lot of people are skeptical about Ukraine's ability to do that, given that they have a smaller population than Russia. Russia can always just mag dump people on their opponents. Less capable of doing that these days than they were as the Soviets or as the Russian Empire. But given that they're fighting Ukraine and Ukraine only right now, that is an option. But the alternative is nothing. There is no alternative. Like I said at the start earlier, if you come to Russia and say, hey, we want a peace deal, we want a ceasefire, they're going to interpret that as saying that Russia is winning and that if they keep fighting, they can get everything they want. Russia has no reason at this point to stop fighting. Right? Their economy is not collapsing, and it's likely not going to. They've encountered some more difficulties, but it's nothing like too pressing. Mm-hmm. So, their economy is holding up. Their army is a little shaky, but it's holding up for the most part. So, they can hang in there. They can drag the war out if they want and, end it or escalate it as they like. And in that circumstances, given that they have those structural advantages against Ukraine, they can just win by continuing to fight, especially if the West caves in and just quits. So they have every reason to continue going. And any signal you send them that suggests that Western support is wavering or that Ukraine itself might be wavering, they'll just interpret that as a win for them, mm-hmm. right? That's their plan. Just wait it out. Keep going. Just let those structural advantages win the war for you. You really don't have to do anything too risky, in a sense, if you're Russia in this situation. So the flip side of that then for Ukraine is that they just need to continue holding on as best they can. Russia may be able to prevent the Ukrainians from taking back liberated territory, but the Ukrainians can drag out the war too and prevent the Russians from achieving any more objectives than they've already achieved. So long as Ukraine gets financing from the West and continues to maintain its own will to fight, they should be able to hang on long enough for Russia to eventually, after what's going to be a painfully long time, to finally agree to some kind of ceasefire. But for now, they just have no incentive to do that. They don't think the West is going to stick in for long term, and they think that eventually Ukraine will cave in itself. Mm-hmm. So just continuing the pressure is their strategy, and it's a long-term strategy. And when it comes to long-term strategies, you need either something dramatic to happen in the short term to shake things up enough to force them to change their strategy, or you just have to match their long-term strategy with one of your own. Mm-hmm. And that's where we are. Like, do we want to commit to Ukraine over the long term? Yes or no? More people are saying no than before, but overall the sentiment is largely pro-Ukraine. So if we can do that, Ukraine can hold on and get a win. Again, it could be an ugly win, but it'll be a win.
Yeah, I think the other thing that has the West even more so on the side of Ukraine is if the West gives up on Ukraine, that's kind of setting a precedent for Russia to continue to lean West and think of the next potential target, because they very unsneakily kind of leaned in and just occupied a bunch of territory and so on, and they take Crimea with the secret green men and that kind of thing. So having that kind of tactic they could apply to another country. They do have NATO countries that would obviously create a greater response than just sending aid most likely, but yeah, I think that's the overall concern that continues to motivate the West beyond just Ukraine in particular, which is fully valid. Like, backing up Ukraine and their sovereignty is fully valid, but I think a lot of it's kind of protecting the borders where they are and preventing that slide westward.
Yeah, precedent and the international order are definitely big objectives for the West and the United States in particular. The United States does not have like a direct strategic interest in Ukraine. It's not necessarily threatening to the integrity of the United States to have Russia in Ukraine, to beat Ukraine in a war. We'll be fine either way.
Mm-hmm.
Europe, a little more shaky. Obviously, Eastern Europe is way less comfortable with a Russia win than, say, the United States, certainly more so than Western Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Western Europe tends to be a little more cagey about it. They sympathize with Ukraine, but they're also disproportionately being impacted by the economic weight of the dislocation caused by the war. So opinion tends to be a little more mixed in the Western Europe than in Eastern Europe. And even in Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, there tends to be more Russophile sentiment. Places like Bulgaria, for example, especially Serbia, and to a lesser degree Hungary, they tend to be more friendly towards Russia in general. So, they're not as worried per se about a Russia win in Ukraine. But Poland and the Baltic states, very concerned.
Mm-hmm.
They've been the most hawkish members of the European community as far as Europe's response to Russia's war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So their sentiment is very much in favor of continued support. So it kind of differs by country just how disruptive and threatening the war has been thus far. And so, the question is regarding the United States, though. So for the United States, kind of limited impact overall in terms of strategic interest. But there's also a bigger strategic picture, which is that the United States benefits broadly from a stable international system. We're a trading nation. We trade with everybody. We have a lot of interest in trying to prevent wars from breaking out all over the world. So in so much as a precedent like Russia successfully invading Ukraine would pose, disrupts that established order, the United States, by extension, has an interest in trying to preserve it. That is to say, prevent that precedent from disrupting the established order. So there is kind of a big picture strategic argument in favor of supporting Ukraine. But a lot of people don't really buy that, or don't care, or just don't think it's worth the money. So, there is political sentiment against it just inherently. There's always been isolationist sentiment in the United States. And it's kind of been a running problem throughout America's history as far as credibility. World War II ends. Everybody's asking the United States to stay in Europe to try to deter the Soviet Union. But broad swaths of the United States did not want to do that. And so the result is that the American commitment to Europe in the form of NATO was somewhat undermined by the broad-based knowledge. Everybody knew that big chunks of the U.S. polity did not really want to commit to Europe's security. And so the fact that that isolationist sentiment was so powerful meant that successive American governments had to go out of their way to underline American credibility to allies, with the result that we ended up doing a lot of stupid shit, basically. If you can make a strong, credible commitment to security, nobody doubts it, and you don't have to do stuff to prove it. But if there are doubts about your credibility, then you do have to do stuff to prove it. You have to go above and beyond to show that you're really, really committed, even in spite of doubts back in the United States. And so then you end up with stuff like Vietnam, right? There were different reasons we were in Vietnam for so long. But one of them is that successive governments were afraid that if the United States cut and run in Vietnam, then it would prove all of the doubters about American security commitments right, and that American credibility would be irrevocably undermined to the point where there would be more conflict, not less, in the world. So that was one of the underlying arguments for staying in Vietnam as long as we were. And that was a direct outgrowth of concerns about credibility. If those concerns had not been there, the United States government would have been much less hesitant to pull out of Vietnam, and the war might have been much shorter, ironically. So you've seen similar credibility commitment issues in other areas, especially since the end of the Cold War. The Cold War was the main thing keeping the U.S. invested in European security, among other regions of the world. But once the Soviets were gone, the isolationist sentiment kind of had a new tool to use, which is that we don't have a main rival anymore. Why are we still underwriting global security? Mm-hmm. And so the argumentation in favor of continuing to have a global role has merit. Global economic prosperity, in large part, can be attributed, well, maybe not in large part, but at least in part, a significant part can be attributed to the global role that the United States plays in providing global security. So there is value in it, but at the same time, it can't be denied that it's expensive. It does not directly benefit many average Americans on a personal level. And also, the fact that America has a global role represents global temptations, presents global temptations that various American governments have not been able to resist. You know, as the Madeleine Albright quote went, we have all this power. I can't remember how exactly it goes, but basically the quote was to the effect of, we have all of this power, we might as well use it. And so the temptation to use power that you have available to you is often irresistible, especially for people in government. And the result has been some misadventures, to put it mildly. Less so, say, the intervention in Bosnia, although that's debatable. But yeah, definitely the Iraq War, and to a lesser degree Afghanistan, turned out to be big clusterfucks. And most likely the United States government would not have perpetrated those invasions if it had more of an isolationist sentiment and if it had a smaller role in global affairs, certainly in global security affairs. So you can't entirely begrudge people for being skeptical at this point of global security commitments by the United States. So that's kind of where the debate is and where the battle is right now as far as Ukraine support. But I would argue in favor of an international role for the United States. Nobody else can really do it. And in so much as there are other states interested in it, you will probably not like their human rights record. So, you know, it's a dirty job, but really somebody has to do it. And the United States is probably, on average, going to do it in a way that relatively more people in the world will like than not. That's not a great resounding endorsement, but, you know, we live in an imperfect world, so you kind of got to take what you can get.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the basic, like, if you're playing Civilization Games 101, you might love to be all about science and peace and culture, but then the bandits wreck your base and you have to start a new game. So someone is going to have to manage the violence on the planet and create an active deterrent to expansionist behavior. That's just one of the unfortunate truths of our reality, is violence is a thing on this planet, and even if you have all the best intentions to be kind and good to others, someone's going to fuck shit up and you may need to step in and stop them or defend yourself, that sort of thing. And it's going to end up boiling down to, okay, well, who are the biggest players on the board and can they steward their power in such a way that they aren't destroying stuff? And yeah, definitely it's going to create a checkered history for whatever country has that role. But there is going to be someone in that position. It's not as though we can just balance everyone's military like a sports league where it's like, okay, everyone can only spend this much on their military this year and we're going to keep it even across the board. People are obviously going to cheat at that and be corrupt. So
yeah, you know, I'm not your mother. I'm not going to tell you what to believe on here. I'm not going to tell people they're wrong, you know, for preferring an isolationist approach to American foreign policy, especially in light of all the disasters. You know, you can hardly begrudge them that. And in general, I don't generally advocate. It's great grammar. In general, I don't advocate for one position or the other. But I would just point out that I generally think the argument in favor of global role for the United States is a little stronger here. Because one of the central arguments people against a global role make is that those resources spent on America's global role could be spent at home. And that's a weak argument to me because I'm extremely confident that resources saved from that global role being rescinded will not be spent on the public. Money savings that the federal government finds generally go into one of the military, debt reduction, or tax cuts. And certainly those things do benefit certain Americans, but probably on the whole, most average Americans will not feel that very much.
Yeah.
They're certainly not going to do things like invest in people. Like at this point, American politics is so dysfunctional and disjointed that a program like that is almost certainly off the cards, regardless of circumstances. So I don't really see criticisms that resources are being misspent here as being entirely valid, given that they would not be spent on valid objectives anyway. Yeah, so the opportunity cost, I guess, to put it in economic terms, is very low. Let's put it like that. That's a simpler way of putting it.
Mhm.
The opportunity cost of aid sent to Ukraine is very low because you're not actually, in effect, giving up that much, given that dysfunctional American politics isn't going to use the money on you anyway. So I would offer that rebuttal. And I know I'm running long, so I'm just going to cut it short there. There's other stuff about Ukraine we can get to, but we'll save it for next time.
Well, I appreciate you coming on and catching us up on everything. I know it's been a couple weeks. Chat, thank you for your perspectives. You'll have a lot to read today. I want to give a special shout out to Chat in not getting into a silly fight this week. Last time we had a world discussion, it was a little bit ornery. It was very well balanced, and people expressed some different opinions, and no one really got into a fight. So, wow, clap. Well played. I know it's hard to resist, especially when we talk about a U.S. primary debate, but nevertheless, the chat did not go crazy. So good job, chat. And thanks for hanging out. Thank you, Agent Smith, for coming on and providing your expertise as always. And we will see you on the next episode of Will Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.